Hello everybody, I'm Eternal Flame here, and welcome to What If Yuji Awakened Anti-Gravity. Now I already had done What If Yuji had gotten Blood Manipulation and What If Yuji had gotten Shrine. I feel it's only fair that I finally complete the trio of curse techniques he could have potentially gotten. Which is What If Yuji had Awakened Anti-Gravity. Anti-Gravity is the curse technique that belongs to Yuji Itadori's mom, Kaori Itadori. And ever since that was revealed, it was speculated that was the curse technique that Yuji was going to awaken, since they specifically gave it to Yuji's mom, but he never awakened it, so that's what's going to be the point of the story. Now, since I've already done What If Yuji had started with Blood Manipulation, and I did What If Yuji had awakened Shrine against Mahito, I feel it's only fair that I do What If Yuji had awakened Anti-Gravity against Hanami. How will this change the timeline in the story? Well, let's find out now. Aoi Todo stated that he would not assist Yuji Itadori until he landed a Black Flash, and while his first attempt wasn't successful, the second one was. Showered in sparks of black, Yuji had truly gotten a taste for his curse energy. However, the Black Flash had also done something else for him. It pushed forward a dormant technique, truly awakening it. The first, though, to notice wasn't Yuji, wasn't Todo, wasn't Hanami, but it was Ryomen Sukuna. As he tilted his head, raising an eyebrow, before he said, "Oh, now that is a little bit intriguing." He wasn't expecting a curse like that to be awakened today, but now he was even more intrigued. He was curious how this battle was going to go, and what Yuji Itadori was capable of now. And when Todo and Yuji looked over to Hanami, a unique effect happened this time. While Hanami was launched back quite a bit and their arm heavily damaged, they were also floating in the air. They should have made contact with the ground by now, but they didn't. That caused Todo and Yuji to look a little bit confused, as the cogs worked in Todo's brain. This wasn't the standard effect of a Black Flash. Something much more unusual had happened this time. And Todo began to problem solve as he thought, is that his curse technique? It has to be. Yuji Itadori, my brother. Not just did you get a true taste for your curse energy, but you managed to awaken something that not even I could have expected from you. You truly are amazing. I didn't expect anything less from my brother. Now, shall we get cooking? Yuji was taking a moment to analyze this, to analyze what he had just awakened, what he had just utilized. He needed to memorize that experience, memorize that utilization, and figure out how to use it in combat. Unfortunately, he had no experience whatsoever of using this curse technique, not even any muscle memory through Sukuna. But still, he felt he might be able to use it if he focused. He just had to get in the zone. As Yuji and Todo both rushed forward, Yuji both focusing on the feeling of landing a Black Flash, as well as the feeling of using anti-gravity again. Most of the battle went the same though, with Yuji being unable to manifest that technique, but the major change came when Yuji and Todo began to combo Hanami. As during one of the punches, Yuji finally figured it out, utilizing anti-gravity to keep Hanami in the air. And Todo couldn't help but smirk, realizing that Yuji was getting more and more adjusted to that experience. But what impressed him even more was the fact that Yuji was consecutively able to use 4 Black Flashes in a row. With each Black Flash he landed, he knocked Hanami closer and closer back to the start of the fight. He couldn't tell why, but part of his instincts knew Todo wanted to head to that direction. More than that though, he was forcefully holding Hanami up in the air for longer and longer. At the start it was only a second, but now he was able to push 3 seconds. Hanami needed to open up their domain expansion, but they weren't getting a chance to do that, especially with how relentless Yuji was. As Yuji landed another punch, keeping Hanami in the air for a total of 3 seconds, but at the same time the barrier broke. Gojo Satoru had now entered the barrier, and while Hanami was originally planning to cast their domain expansion, they knew that was a foolish task, not with Gojo here. Gojo had to admit he was impressed. You could sense not just Yuji had improved his curse energy, but at the same time he managed to awaken a cursing that he wasn't expecting him to awaken right now. Sure, he was aware that he could awaken anti-gravity, and he was planning to bring that up at a later date, but now it had already come, and he couldn't help but be a little bit proud of that. This was something they were most definitely going to have to work on later, but for now he had a battle to focus on. Hanami was trying to force themselves to reconnect with the ground, but thanks to Yuji's anti-gravity it was making it hard. But as they landed, the second they did, they tried to reconnect themselves with the ground again, but Yuji didn't let them, as they landed another punch right onto Hanami. A look of worry entered onto Todo, not for Yuji's sake against Hanami, but for Yuji's sake against Gojo, because now Yuji was right in the way of a hollow purple. So at the last moment, Todo clapped and swapped Yuji's place with one of Megami's blades, remembering they were nearby the start of the battle. And out of the 2 cursed tools that could be sacrificed, Playful Cloud was definitely the one that would be much more of value. as a whole purple completely vaporized Hanami, forcefully kept in the air to have to take it head on. Todo was also certain about something else. Hanami was most definitely dead with that risky move that Yuji pulled. And while he did manage to defeat a special grade disaster curse, Mahito had succeeded in his own mission of stealing the cursed fingers. Gojo was definitely rather proud of his student, but at the same time he was also now intrigued about what this new ability was, and how was he not able to see it earlier. They definitely have to do some work on that later. Meanwhile, Geto was getting the data report from Mahito, and he had to admit he was surprised. Somehow they managed to successfully kill Hanami? How? They shouldn't have been capable of that. Sure, he was aware of the fact that Gojo was the one who finished them off, but even with that in mind, they still did incredibly well against them. But that was more intriguing than anything else, and gonna be a little bit more annoying for when he wanted to seal away Satoru Gojo. At first he wasn't aware of how they did it, but when he got the information and data from his spy, he had to admit he was shocked and impressed even further. Yuji had awakened the cursed that belonged to his mother, not something that he'd expected at all to happen. While he was tempted to tell the others for a moment, he ultimately decided not to. He was curious to see how Mahito would evolve with this shock. This was going to cause a small alteration to Kenjaku's plan. He was going to need a different cursed spirit to replace Hanami. And we now head into Shibuya. Now I know the Origin of Obedience arc is also supposed to happen, but I don't think it's really that worth covering. Yuji is just stronger with the anti-gravity technique. I don't really see it going any different, aside from it being a little bit easier for Yuji and Nobara. But during the short time, Yuji was starting to figure out some new things about his curse technique. In order to utilize anti-gravity, he needed to make contact with whoever he wanted to use it on. At least for now. Gojo did speculate that Yuji might be able to use it without contact in the future, but that was far in the future from now. But Yuji honestly kinda preferred this. He was much more used to hand-to-hand combat and that being his style, so it made it a lot easier for him to incorporate. It was why he was now trying to use it in as many spars or fights as he could, whether against cursed spirits or his fellow allies. He wanted to make sure it was as natural as breathing for him. Fortunately for him, his test was going to arrive. Something for him to push anti-gravity to its limits. The Shibuya incident. When Yuji arrived, he was rather curious to test out how this battle was going to go. Not just was he more proficient with his curse technique now, he also knew he was much better with curse energy reinforcement in comparison to before. Having a curse technique most certainly helped with practicing his curse energy control, which in turn fed into his reinforcement. Yuji was being paired up with Meimei in order to enter into Shibuya Station. Yuji and Meimei were forced to separate, with Yuji taking on the Grasshopper Curse. A fight that was no trouble for this Yuji. Yuji repeatedly using anti-gravity to catch the Grasshopper Curse off guard, using it in order to force him to repeatedly float in the air. Finishing it off with a hard punch right on his face, exercising the Grasshopper Curse. In spite of the efficiency that Yuji was taking on the Grasshopper Curse with, it wasn't enough to get to Gojo on time. Mekamaru had informed Yuji Itadori that Gojo Satoru had been sealed, forcing Yuji to have to split up from the other two in order to go warn everybody else in Shibuya what their new task was, that Gojo Satoru was sealed and they had to free him no matter what. Leading to Nanami heading out in order to back up Nobara, as Yuji and Megumi prepared to face off against Awasaka, while at the same time Ino was facing off against Sogami. Yuji was the first to close the distance, as he landed a punch right onto Awasaka's stomach, at the same time activating anti-gravity, forcing Awasaka even further into the air before Yuji followed that up by a couple more punches. Divine Dog took advantage of this chance as they landed a hard slash right onto Awasaka's chest. However, even though it was a perfect hit, followed by another perfect bite, neither did any true damage to Awasaka. No, it did do damage, but it was such a minor amount that it might as well have not hurt, as Gamma's tongue then wrapped around Awasaka's stomach, causing quite a bit of pain onto Awasaka before he was slammed right into a bridge. Yuji and Megumi both looked a little bit confused at that. Divine Dog and both of their hits should most definitely have been able to do quite a bit of damage to him, but they didn't. It wasn't like Awasaka was strong. Megumi then led the charge, as he began to release a flurry of slashes right onto Awasaka. But Awasaka was blocking each and every single one of them. But Yuji suddenly jumped over both Megumi as well as Awasaka, landing behind him and landing a punch right onto Awasaka's back, using anti-gravity once more to launch Awasaka a bit higher into the air and Megumi to slash at him, launching Awasaka right into one of the walls. But in spite of that, it didn't really seem to do any damage to him. Megumi then got an idea before yelling, "Gojo's in Shibuya, you know. You better leave the curtain behind and run." And that made Awasaka chuckle, before he revealed that they had already been aware of Gojo being sealed, mainly because of them yelling out that Gojo has been sealed. After all, if that hadn't happened, they wouldn't be out here. They would just be asleep in bed, not wanting to fight Satoru Gojo. And that finally led Megumi to figure out what his technique was. If his technique was damage nullification, he'd be confident he could take on Gojo more than likely, or at least have a lot more confidence than what he was showing right now. Gojo wouldn't be able to hurt him other than through his domain, and Gojo's domain wasn't common knowledge. Which meant it had to be something else, and he had an idea of something that would allow him to test it. As Megumi then told Yuji, "I have a plan. First just let me lead." Before he made the hand sign summoning Rabbit Escape and handing Yuji the main rabbit. As a swarm of rabbits began to run right towards Awasaka's direction, with one of them landing right onto his shoulder. And Megumi saw it, a massive impact be landed in that moment. He realized exactly what the curse technique was. Quickly explaining to Yuji that Awasaka's curse technique was the ability to reverse damage. However, it was limited. After all, he wasn't taking massive lethal amount of damage from the air brushing past him. And more importantly, if he had a curse technique like that, he'd be confident about taking on Satoru Gojo. But this one about reversing damage made a lot more sense, especially with what one of the rabbits had done. Yuji nodded. Now he knew what the plan was. Both Megumi and Yuji couldn't just weaken their attacks, or else they could risk Awasaka turning off the curse technique. Instead, they would have to pressure him on both sides, strong and weak attacks all at once, to cover each potential outcome. The rabbits then all turned to a shadowy puddle, before Max Elephant landed directly on top of Awasaka. But Awasaka pushed Max Elephant off of his body, chuckling a little bit. He was most certainly entertained. Before a car was launched right towards him, Yuji not even giving him a second to relax or think. Awasaka just narrowly moved out of the way as he thought to himself, what power, what speed? Did he use anti-gravity to make it lighter? No, he didn't. That was just his pure raw curse energy reinforcement. Anti-gravity wouldn't have affected the car like that. Before both Megumi and Yuji rushed right towards him. And right before the two of them could make contact, Gamma's tongue hit him right in the stomach. Under normal circumstances, Gamma wouldn't have caused much damage to whoever they hit. However, thanks to Awasaka's curse technique, that was the exception. As Awasaka took heavy damage, confirming Megumi's fury once and for all. Both Yuji and Megumi landed a hard punch right onto Awasaka, Megumi landing it on his gut while at the same time Yuji landed it on his face. Awasaka tried turning off his curse technique mainly to trick them, but it didn't work. They figured out his curse technique, as a large amount of curse energy focused around Yuji's body, while Awasaka was forced to be floating in the air from Yuji's anti-gravity, before he finished it off, not with a strong punch, but a weak one right to Awasaka's face, knocking him out. The two then noticed upon Awasaka's defeat the barrier had been shattered. Sorcerers could now move freely throughout Shibuya, before suddenly both of them sensed Ino rocketing down towards them. While Megumi prepared Nue in order to catch Ino, Yuji at the last moment jumped up higher. While Megumi was aware of the fact that Yuji could jump up pretty high, this was much higher than normal. Unknowingly, in that moment, Yuji had activated anti-gravity on his own body, using that to catch Ino for the both of them to land on Nue's back, as well as using anti-gravity to slow down Ino's fall a little bit. But Megumi didn't have much time to think on that. His bigger focus was getting Ino out of here. He needed help. So with that, Yuji headed into the station while at the same time Megumi took Ino away, aiming to get him over to Shoko so he could get healed. He'd back them up later after he was done. And two of them split up immediately, both in a rather big rush. While Yuji was running, he saw so many transfigured humans. There were way too many for him to be able to save. Fortunately, he had a reliable ally in Ino, as Ino used cursed speech in order to allow Yuji to move forward, trusting in Ino to save these people while Yuji himself headed into the subway. But somebody else was already there waiting for him. The eldest brother of the death paintings, Choso. As the moment Yuji landed, he lifted up both of his arms, blocking a piercing blood coming right towards him, just narrowly managing to block it on time, but still, it was fast. It was insanely fast. He could feel it might go through his arms, so his only option was to push it upwards into the wall instead, as he began to move away from it, but even still, Choso changed the direction the piercing blood was going at by moving his arms. Even with that in mind, it was still significantly slower in comparison to before, as Yuji quickly closed the gap and landed a punch right onto Choso, a double impact landing from the divergent fist, but at the same time he activated anti-gravity, giving Choso even more airborne time as he was hit into the ceiling before landing back on his feet. As Choso thought to himself, he wasn't supposed to have a curse technique. Still, I doubt it will matter too much. I'll kill him either way. But there was also the double impact from before. That's not something normal curse energy does. However, before two of them could continue, Choso asked Yuji if his brothers had any last words. And after Yuji realized who his brothers were, he told them that they didn't have any last words, but they cried. and with that a storm of blood erupted from Choso's back. He was going to kill Yuji Itadori no matter what. However, he was rather quick to realize that he couldn't let Yuji get close to him. Based on everything you could tell, Yuji's technique required direct contact. Even more than that, Yuji had insane physical power. Fortunately, that was a combat style that Choso was more than adept with. After all, he was a ranged combatant. As 3 small blood orbs began to rise behind him, and he focused blood into his hands, Yuji was quite fast to realize that Choso was about to fire off another piercing blood. So as a feint, he jumped high into the air before landing down, ducking right underneath the piercing blood coming towards him. And almost subconsciously to close the gap, he activated anti-gravity on himself again, using it in order to move right towards Choso and land a punch right on his stomach, even before Choso could lower his arms down to hit Yuji with the piercing blood. However, the 3 blood orbs did immediately explode right when Yuji was trying to do another punch, all of them activating a supernova on Yuji and launching him backwards. But right as Choso took out the blood knife, he felt his body float. He wasn't close enough, and Yuji had just barely enough time to dodge one of the blood knife stabs, leading to Yuji taking advantage of it and kicking Choso straight in the face. While Choso just narrowly blocked on time, he felt his body begin to float again from anti-gravity, as Yuji punched him straight in the back, sending him flying forwards by a couple of feet. And right as Yuji was about to rush towards Choso again, he saw Choso clap his hands together, but there wasn't any blood orbs there. The fake-out worked exactly as Choso had hoped, as he activated Flowing Red Scale, sweeping Yuji by the leg and palm striking him straight in the face. But as Choso was about to fire another piercing blood towards Yuji, he activated anti-gravity, using it to make a massive distance and avoid the piercing blood before it could come towards him. That was when Mechamaru activated and realized that Yuji was fighting Choso. But because of how Choso functioned, blood manipulation had no weakness. For someone like Kamo, he had a weakness of how much blood he could draw upon, but Choso didn't have that weakness. As Yuji started to bounce all over the place, he was starting to realize what he was doing. He was feeling lighter. No, that wasn't it. He wasn't being held back by gravity anymore. Still, that was currently only really useful for dodging. As Mechamaru then said, "Head to the bathroom. I have a theory, but I'm not certain if this is going to work." Hearing that, Yuji went full speed and launched himself straight towards the bathroom. However, that ended up catching Choso a little bit off guard and confusing him, until Mechamaru taunted him, calling him a coward. And when Choso ran in, he saw several sprinklers begin to activate. The water was going all across the place, as Itadori went behind him and punched him straight into the washroom, using anti-gravity to make sure he was launched back further in. Choso was now unable to perform blood manipulation outside of his own body. Yuji had now gained the advantage thanks to Mechamaru. As Choso upgraded Flowing Red Scale, going to Flowing Red Scale stack, Yuji and Choso both lifted up their hands, preparing to fight and finish this battle off once and for all. Yuji and Choso quickly exchanged a flurry of blows. While Choso was succeeding in blocking several of the blows, he was currently forced on the defensive, until one of the blows made contact with him and activated anti-gravity, allowing Yuji to duck underneath one of Choso's punches as he was aiming for his face, while at the same time landing a kick right onto Choso's stomach. And as Yuji was about to continue, he suddenly felt a massive amount of pain in his liver. Choso had kept a blood meteorite secret and used it at that very moment, piercing right through his liver. But Yuji took a breath in and a breath out. He wasn't going to go down. Even if he died here, no matter what, he was going to take down Choso. His role was going to be to make it easier for his friends. That way they could at least succeed in saving Satoru Gojo. Choso was able to see that determination enter into Yuji's eyes, and he could tell that Yuji was a massive threat, as he hardened the blood inside of his hands, now increasing the risk of developing thrombosis on himself. But so long as it meant taking out Yuji, it was a necessary risk that must be taken. Choso was aware of the massive risk he was at right now. The fact they were fighting in a washroom, the fact they were forced to go hand to hand gave Yuji a massive advantage, mainly because of his anti-gravity technique. But still, he had to win this. Choso and Yuji both rushed towards each other, continuing to exchange a flurry of blows. Yuji was able to predict several of where Choso's blows were going for, using the small moments they were touching to use anti-gravity on Choso's body, using it to disrupt his balance, even avoiding a sweep thanks to that anti-gravity, also using it on himself in order to disrupt Choso's moves, making it harder in particular for him to go for the legs, even using that to move behind one of the bathroom stalls before kicking it wide open and landing a kick right onto Choso's face, using anti-gravity to get there even faster, using his legs to grab Choso by the face and launch him towards one of the walls, activating anti-gravity again in order to hold him in the air for a little bit longer, as he rushed towards him and landed a palm strike right onto Choso's side. But Choso at the last moment hardened the blood on his side, using that in order to and catching Yuji off guard by the toughness of it, allowing him to land a perfect blow right onto Yuji's chest, sending him flying right towards one of the walls. At the last moment though, Yuji managed to catch himself. Thankfully he wasn't as damaged in comparison to before. Still, he did feel the clash with the wall. Even though he lessened the damage, it still did hurt. More than that though, Yuji had been knocked out of the bathroom stall, which means Choso could now approach him. As Choso then clapped his hands together before saying, "When you get to the other side, be sure to ask for my brother's forgiveness," before clapping his hands together and firing a piercing blood right towards Yuji's chest, going through his heart and killing Itadori Yuji. As he did so, a memory played through Choso's head, one that didn't exist. Realizing in that moment Itadori Yuji was his brother, but how? How could that function? How did that work? No, none of that mattered anymore because he killed him. He killed Itadori Yuji. And he ran out, leaving behind the body of Itadori. Little did he know, two other people began to approach, Mimiko and Nanako. Nanako had fed Itadori 1 finger. Jogo had fed him the remaining 10. Ryoma and Sukuna had reawakened. Though now that Sukuna had control over Yuji's body, there was something he was rather curious to test out. The new cursing that he had access to, anti-gravity. Now he didn't need the curse technique, not one bit, but it was more so out of a curiosity of what he could do with it. He then entered into a binding vow with Jogo. If Jogo could land a single hit on him, he would eradicate every single life in Shibuya, aside from the life of Megami Fushiguro, already executing Mimiko and Nanako for their disrespect. And Jogo was immediately launched out of the building, being launched rapidly through the air with Sukuna trailing right behind him, moving even faster than he was normally. Thanks to access to anti-gravity, he was figuring out some new things he could do with it. But an idea immediately came to mind. Sukuna had already healed off the wounds Choso had left on his body, including the piercing blood that was launched through Yuji's chest. But that gave him a breath of inspiration. Before activating anti-gravity, no, he reversed it. He activated gravity, enhancing the gravity field right around Jogo, and as a result of that, not just Jogo, but the building nearby Jogo was completely slammed down onto the ground. With Sukuna's massive amounts of curse energy and divine curse energy control, doing something like this was no trouble for him, as Jogo coughed up some blood from that slam. And as he looked towards Jogo, he couldn't help but smile a little bit, as he said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." Jogo's eyes would widen as he was slammed down right through a building. As he tried to force himself up to no luck, as he saw the building begin to collapse on him. At the last moment though, he was able to move, just narrowly moving himself out of the way of the collapsing building. A smirk would slowly rise onto Sukuna, as he was realizing this was going to be quite a fun tool to play around with. As he chuckled a little bit to himself and said, "Of course, the brat barbarian he is only thought to limit himself to hand with his utilization of this technique." As Jogo then launched himself right towards Sukuna, attempting to launch a burst of lava at him, but before he could, Sukuna landed a palm strike on Jogo. But while Jogo was aimed towards the ground, instead he was launched high up, going through several clouds and slamming right through a jet. And Sukuna smirked a little bit as he said, "And the simple-minded brat limited himself as well." When he fought anti-gravity, the first thing he of course thought of was zero gravity. So instead, he went for minimal changes, something that I don't think he even realized he did. But we can go for much greater. As anti-gravity deactivated for Jogo once again as he was falling down towards the ground. Realizing that this must be Itadori Yuji's curse technique, he was starting to realize he really needed to keep his distance. Jogo then landed on top of one of the rooftops as he began to rapid-fire several of his lava shikigami right towards him, each of them shaped like small dragonflies. Sukuna then decided to swap curse techniques as he launched out several slashes towards each of them, slicing through each of them and causing them to prematurely activate, before he vanished from where he was standing. Sukuna was already a monster when it came to speed, but with anti-gravity on his side, he was no longer limited by gravity. Able to appear near instantly in front of Jogo and grab him by the face, slamming him down right through the building in a matter of microseconds. Jogo then placed both of his hands on the ground, making a massive amount of lava erupt from underneath Sukuna. But Sukuna then jumped high into the air, using anti-gravity in order to make himself float even longer. As Jogo started to redirect that lava, trying to use it in waves in order to hit Sukuna, but he was moving around it, now using anti-gravity in order to allow himself to fly with fine-tuned control. Sukuna was able to step on air thanks to his curse energy manipulation. However, flying was something completely different. It was rather rare for a sorcerer to have this capability, but Sukuna was making sure he was going to enjoy this. As Jogo continued to create more and more lava, using it in order to make a mass amount of lava to grab two buildings and try and throw them right towards Sukuna. And that was Sukuna to getting an idea, as he smirked a little bit before he pointed forward, and the buildings suddenly stopped in their tracks. Anti-gravity via normal means was an impossible concept, due to a repulsive force not existing for gravity. However, through curse energy and the utilization of this technique, impossible was made possible, as both of the buildings were repulsed from Sukuna, launched right towards Jogo instead. Jogo was just narrowly able to avoid that on time, using fire underneath his feet in order to launch himself at full speed, just narrowly avoiding the buildings being launched towards him. Right now, Jogo was just a testing dummy for Sukuna to test out whatever he wanted on him. If Jogo wasn't a cursed spirit and didn't have his regeneration, he would have been dead since the first move of this fight. Jogo never knew just how thankful he was for his own anatomy, something that most cursed spirits took for granted. However, if he managed to remember in his next life, he certainly wasn't going to. As Sukuna then pointed forward again, and he began to release a rapid amount of slashes right towards Jogo's direction. Slices that were big enough to cut through buildings. As Jogo was forced to go on the defensive again, trying his best to avoid each of those slashes he could, but several of them cut through several of his limbs. Before Sukuna rushed right towards him again, palm striking him straight in the stomach, but also utilizing anti-gravity again to launch him even further into the air, before using anti-gravity on himself to fly right above Jogo. And he slammed both of his fists right down onto Jogo's head, using that to launch him straight through several of the buildings and having them all collapse onto him. Jogo began to twitch with anger, with rage. He still had one thing he could do. Using his domain expansion wasn't going to be a solution, not against someone like Sukuna. So he had to rely on something else, as Sukuna at the same time sends Kusakabe and Panda. In particular, remembering that Panda was one of the brat's friends, as he appeared right in front of them. As he said, "None of you are allowed to move until I say so. If you do, you will be crushed to death." And they each saw a massive meteor begin to form up, one so massive that if it were to land on any of them, it would kill them in an instant. Sukuna's smirk began to widen as he stared towards the meteor, as he gave all of them permission to move, vanishing right after. While Kusakabe was just narrowly able to dodge, Panda ended up getting hit by the shockwave. The two other members of Geto's family were crushed to death by said meteor. Jogo panted a little bit. He had no idea Sukuna was capable of dodging something like that, but he didn't doubt it, as Sukuna appeared behind him and said, "Nice one. If that hit, that might have caused me a little bit of damage. You should be proud of yourself. Though, I'm wondering why you're not using your domain." Jogo coughed up a little bit of blood as he said, "Simple. It wouldn't matter what technique you use as your sure hit. I would lose." That caused a laugh to come from Sukuna, as he taunted him, calling him a loser, before saying, "Very well. I'll face you with your own specialty then." Sukuna then activated his fire arrow while Jogo lifted up his hand, fire rising in it. Sukuna then turned Jogo to ashes with the fire arrow, giving Jogo some final words before he passed on to the afterlife. Urame then arrived, bowing to Sukuna. But before the two of them could exchange any more words, they both sensed a sudden mass amount of curse energy spike. Mahoraga had been summoned. Megumi Fushiguro was in danger. So Sukuna told Urame to begin the preparations before he vanished, using anti-gravity in order to get there at full speed, moving both Megumi and Haruta out of the way from a strike from Mahoraga. And he was curious, what was this Shikigami? What was this beast? As he used reverse curse sneak on Megumi for a moment in order to make sure he was stabilized, before turning in order to face off against Mahoraga. Mahoraga slammed his blade right down onto Sukuna, lifting up one arm in order to block, but as he did, he could feel positive curse energy flow through the blade. If he was a cursed spirit, that would have killed him. But he moved out of the way, dodging, as Mahoraga's blow landed on the ground, causing a massive crater to form. Before Sukuna kicked Mahoraga straight in the cheek, sending him flying right into one of the buildings via using anti-gravity, as he pointed forward and launched a slash right towards Mahoraga, but Mahoraga was rather fast to heal that off. The adaptation process had now begun. Mahoraga had started by trying to drag Sukuna up a wall, successfully doing so, but Sukuna caught himself using one hand. As Sukuna and Mahoraga rapidly began to exchange blows, Mahoraga was going on the offensive, and each time he did, Sukuna was blocking with one hand, then it began to go down to just 2 fingers. In terms of physical speed, even without anti-gravity, he was still superior to Mahoraga, but he was still curious about what this beast was capable of. While they did so, slashes began to tear apart the building itself. With each punch they exchanged, each punch that was blocked, Sukuna launched out a slash. While Sukuna and Mahoraga were launched away from each other, Sukuna wrapped a wire around Mahoraga's body, using it to slam him towards one of the buildings, but as he was doing so, he activated the reversal of anti-gravity, using it to force Mahoraga to be slammed not just hard into the ground, but create a massive crater, launching him through a subway. Another adaptation began for Mahoraga, one to anti-gravity and one to shrine, but it was attempting to figure out which one it should prioritize between the 2 curse techniques. But then Sukuna landed inside, grabbing Mahoraga by the chest and throwing him upwards, activating anti-gravity on his body again, using it in order to land a kick right onto Mahoraga's back and launch him much higher into the air, not just kicking him high above the clouds, but right through another plane. And as Mahoraga was coming down, he saw several buildings being launched right towards them. And Mahoraga started to jump in between the buildings, using them in order to make his way downwards, but as he did, Sukuna was waiting for him, sitting on one of the buildings, before pointing his fingers upwards and launching a massive amount of slashes right towards Mahoraga's direction. Each of them managed to land on the Mahoraga, cutting through him several times and forcing the Mahoraga to land in pieces right where all the buildings were, landing amongst that rubble. As Sukuna sat down on the rooftop again, waiting for the beast to come back, and Mahoraga's body began to heal. It was now focusing its adaptation on Shrine. While anti-gravity was certainly going to be a problem that it would have to deal with soon, Shrine was something it was getting more and more data on, and it was Sukuna's main form of attack. Before Mahoraga jumped right towards Sukuna, its wheel beginning to glow, something Sukuna immediately took notice of as he pointed forward and launched a slice right towards Mahoraga. But this time Mahoraga was able to successfully block, as it lifted up both of its arms while it was launched backwards, but this time it was a little bit different. Mahoraga seemed to be a little bit less effective in comparison to before. Its body healed even faster before it slammed its blade right down onto Sukuna. Sukuna just narrowly dodged as the wheel spun again. And this time Mahoraga was starting to get bigger. Sukuna noticed that shift near immediately. Before Mahoraga attempted to uppercut Sukuna, but Sukuna managed to move out of the way, using anti-gravity on himself to launch himself high into the air. But as he did so, he could see the Mahoraga massively increase in size. So much so that Sukuna barely paled in comparison to the size of his hand, before it then swiped forward, attempting to land a massive slash right onto Sukuna's body, sending him flying right through one of the buildings. Sukuna managed to successfully block, but still, the fact was able to grow that massive. But more importantly, it wasn't using positive curse energy in that slash, it was just using normal curse energy. Before the Mahoraga rapidly launched himself towards Sukuna, shrinking again and slamming its blade right down onto his head. Sukuna at the last moment was able to lift up his arms in order to block, being launched right through a building, but at the same time he could feel its power, its sudden shrinking and growing. Sukuna then pointed his hand forward and began to rapidly launch out several slashes in quick succession, carefully watching Mahoraga this time, as Mahoraga began to block each one. No, he was deflecting each one, as Mahoraga then landed on the ground before picking up a whole building, beginning to spin and throwing it right towards Sukuna's direction. Sukuna then pointed a hand forward and launched out several slashes, slicing the building apart into pieces before activating anti-gravity, causing instead the rubble to float up into the air as Mahoraga and Sukuna rushed towards each other. And they rapidly began to exchange blows, jumping from rubble to rubble, jumping all over the place. If any civilians were nearby, they wouldn't even be able to tell what was happening thanks to how fast they were moving, until Sukuna reached the top of the rubble, deactivating anti-gravity with Mahoraga chasing after him as the rubble began to fall to the ground, before he pointed downward and began to rapidly launch out slashes towards the Mahoraga. But he could see, Mahoraga was able to heal off those slashes rather fast, even faster than before, and Sukuna realized rather fast what his ability was. Similar to the Yamato no Orochi, it was capable of adaptation, as Sukuna rushed down towards the Mahoraga, placing its hand onto its stomach and activating the reversal of anti-gravity, as Mahoraga was slammed hard into the ground, before he activated his domain expansion, one of 140-meter radius. But this was an ineffective method in taking out Mahoraga, something Sukuna was able to realize rather quickly as he activated Furnace. And in one shot, Mahoraga was killed, turned to ash, as a massive explosion of fire, one that could be seen from any point in the city, erupted. And after dropping off Megami to make sure he was healed properly, Sukuna deactivated his domain expansion, and allowed Yuji Itadori to take back control, allowing him to watch the carnage that he had produced. And Yuji was left to stare at the horror he had caused, the horror that had been caused in his body through Sukuna, the horror that had been caused through his curse technique as all of the memories came flooding back into him. And he began to clutch at his head, questioning why he was still alive, but right now there was no time to focus on that. Instead, he needed to focus on continuing to fight. He needed something to fight. He needed something to fight. Unfortunately for him, though, the world heard him loud and clear. When he entered, he saw Hanami with Mahito. As Hanami told him, he left the rest to him, as Mahito used idle transfiguration on Nanami's body and killed him, finishing him off right then and there. Rage entered into Yuji's eyes for a moment, as he stared towards Mahito. Why? Why did all of this have to happen? What the hell was wrong with Mahito? What the hell was wrong with these curses? Mahito was about to try and launch out a transfigured human towards Yuji, but Yuji made the first move, activating anti-gravity on himself. Mahito had always known Yuji was fast, but this was even faster than he could have expected. Yuji also was able to notice that anti-gravity felt easier to use in comparison to normal, or at least the normal that he got so accustomed to. Ryoma and Sukuna using anti-gravity the way he did ended up amplifying Yuji Itadori, something that Yuji Itadori himself wasn't even aware of. When Yuji landed a punch on Mahito's face, Mahito's nose bled. He had to admit Yuji was much stronger in comparison to what he was before, as Mahito was sent backwards, while at the same time activating one of his transfigured humans to try and launch it towards Yuji. But Yuji lifted up a hand, catching it with one hand and activating anti-gravity on it, causing it to float into the air rather fast and slam into the ceiling. Mahito looked a little bit intrigued. While he was aware Yuji had now awakened a curse technique, now he was getting confirmation on what it was. Anti-gravity. Still, he was confident he was going to be able to beat Yuji. After all, he was still nothing more than a brat, something he was going to have more than enough fun breaking. He was already able to figure out some things about how Yuji's technique had functioned. For it to work, he needed to make direct contact on their body, or at least that seemed to be the main method. As Mahito thought to himself, fitting the barbarian only knows how to punch, which meant he was just going to need to keep things at a range, something he could most definitely do. Mahito then activated Soul Multiplicity, launching towards Yuji a massive concoction of flesh, with spikes sticking out from it. The spikes had one purpose. It was to make Yuji hesitate with grabbing it, or at the very least cause some small amount of damage even if he did end up touching it. It opened its mouth, attempting to bite onto Yuji, but Yuji at the last moment was able to use his hands to stop it mid-air, activating anti-gravity on its whole body. But Mahito immediately took advantage of that, turning his hand similar to that of a blade and punching it right into Yuji's skull. However, Yuji was able to reinforce his head with curse energy at the last moment. Still, it did end up causing Yuji to bleed, before Mahito stepped out of the body repel, sending a devious smile to Yuji. Yuji was questioning why. Why did Mahito play with so many people's lives? You are me, Itadori. Confusion rose onto him for a moment before Mahito began to laugh as he said, "This is just a curse-spouting nonsense. But, you know what? Until you accept that fact, there's no way you'll ever beat me." Curse energy then surrounded Mahito's fist as he got an even better idea. Mahito was the one opponent anti-gravity wouldn't be as effective against, mainly because his footing was much harder to mess up since he could alter his body. As both Yuji and Mahito prepared to face off against each other, the true battle had now begun. Mahito then massively increased the size of his hand and sent it pulsing right towards Yuji. As it was doing so, it was tearing through the ground. However, this was merely meant to be a distraction, as several small holes opened up in Mahito's arms, and out from them some transfigured humans fell out. Yuji quickly moved his hand towards the fist and punched it, sending it flying backwards and completely overpowering Mahito, also activating anti-gravity in the process. But as he did so, several transfigured humans rose out from the ground, each of them taking on similar shapes to that of birds, as they flew right towards Yuji and slammed into him repeatedly, each one pushing him back a little bit further. But not just that, Mahito had them all begin to start laughing as well. Each of them were human voices, humans that Yuji had failed to save, humans that Mahito had now taken over. And that was enough to distract Yuji for one moment, as Mahito changed the shape of his legs, changing them to be similar to that of horses, amplifying his speed as he focused curse energy towards his hand and punched Yuji straight in the stomach. As he said, "You know, you should really focus on me," before changing the shape of his hands, changing them to be like claws and launching them right towards Yuji. But what Mahito did earlier only caught him off guard for a brief moment, and now he was pissed. It converted those negative emotions into curse energy near immediately, as he quickly palm-struck the claws away from himself, using them in order to activate anti-gravity, before activating it on himself in order to amplify his own speed, as he launched himself towards Mahito, preparing to punch Mahito in the stomach, but Mahito changed the direction of where his hand was going. Yuji was able to sense this at the last moment, as he quickly flipped backwards, flipping over the claw going straight for his back, resulting in Mahito stabbing himself. Still, that stab didn't do any damage to his own body, as Mahito smirked a bit and said, "See, your anti-gravity, it's pretty useful against most opponents, but against someone like me who can alter the direction his body is going, doesn't really change anything for me." Yuji was realizing in that moment that using anti-gravity on Mahito's body was more than likely useless. Still, he could adjust. He was certain he would, as Yuji focused curse energy around his fists, before launching himself towards Mahito, using anti-gravity in order to go even faster. But out from Mahito's back, a total of 7 small transfigured humans were launched out, and from each of them a spike of flesh was launched towards Yuji from different directions. forcing Yuji to have to be on his toes and start moving around in order to dodge. They were coming from all different types of angles. Still, thanks to his already high levels of speed, it was pretty easy for him to dodge, as Mahito altered the shape of his hand and slashed right down towards Yuji, launching out his arm like a whip in the process in order to get even more range, as Yuji slid underneath it and cut through several of the pillars. But Yuji was rather quick to take advantage of this chance, as the distance was closed between himself and Mahito, and he used the manji kick right on Mahito's face, using anti-gravity to give him the most airtime possible, as he grabbed onto Mahito's arm before he could get launched away and threw him right into one of the walls. And Yuji wasn't giving Mahito a single chance to breathe, as he launched himself right towards Mahito at full speed, curse energy focused towards his hand. Mahito had a second to think, a second to act, as at the last moment he launched out 4 transfigured humans, using that as a shield for himself while he split his body apart. Mahito just barely managed to dodge that hit. He wasn't sure why, but he felt something was going to happen if that hit landed, something he didn't want to be on the other end of receiving, as Mahito reformed himself behind Yuji, changing his arm into the shape of a mace and preparing to slam it right into Yuji's head. But before he could, resonance was activated on Mahito, as several nails pierced right through his chest, catching Mahito completely off guard and making him cough up blood. But more than that, it allowed Yuji to realize he wasn't alone. It allowed him to realize he was never fighting alone, that Nobara was on his side. Yuji immediately took advantage of this chance, as he rushed right towards Mahito and activated anti-gravity on his body, landing a hard punch right on his stomach, before landing another punch, and another, using anti-gravity in order to keep him in the air with every single blow. Mahito then realized exactly what was going to happen, what that feeling was from before, but this time he wouldn't be able to avoid it, as he focused several transfigured humans towards his stomach, the same spot where Yuji landed a black flash right onto him. Mahito activating a binding vow on those 6 transfigured humans, sacrificing their lives in order to make them as durable a shield as possible. And while it definitely lessened the impact, it still hurt like hell, as Mahito was launched backwards through another pillar. Mahito knew he couldn't fight both Yuji and Nobara at the same time, especially now that Yuji had landed a black flash. As he called his double back to himself, he had a plan. He was going to kill Nobara. Yuji could feel it, his understanding of his curse technique, his curse energy. It was all increasing in that moment after he landed the black flash. His ability to utilize it was reaching a brand new height. Mahito, on the other hand, was able to feel the damage on his body after that black flash had landed. While he had been able to use his transfigured humans to block it, it still didn't help him that much. His plan right now was to use the double in order to lure Nobara in here, using it as a distraction to kill Nobara and then Yuji. Mahito then turned, looking towards the stairs, and began to run his way up there, but before he could even make it to one of the steps, Yuji was already ahead of him. Even faster than he was moving before, as Yuji kicked Mahito right in the face, not just kicking him into the ground but through it, launching him towards one of the subway tracks. Mahito felt the pain from that blow. It was even stronger in comparison to before. It gave him a bloody nose, but Yuji wasn't done yet as he launched himself right down towards him, as he jumped inside and landed a hard punch right onto Mahito's gut, using anti-gravity to make sure Mahito was launched even further backwards. Curse energy was emanating off of Yuji's hands. He was able to figure out that Mahito wanted to leave the subway. Yuji was going to make sure that didn't happen. He didn't know why, but he could tell that Mahito did want to leave, as Mahito was slammed right into one of the walls. Mahito was realizing he was in a really bad spot right now, as he sent a new order to the clone. They needed to reunite and fuse back in at one point, but they couldn't risk bringing Nobara here. They needed to dodge for as long as possible and eventually find a way to escape fully. Little did either of them know they were being watched right now. Kenjaku was in that same subway tunnel, quite far away from both of them, but he was still there, sitting down watching. He had sensed what Sukuna was capable of with that curse technique, and now what Yuji was doing as well. It was rather intriguing, but he needed to make sure that Mahito didn't die. He just hoped Mahito would be able to push himself a bit further before he had to act. As he sighed and said, "I suppose I can at least offer you a little bit of help, Mahito." As a clone and Nobara both entered into the subway, but right as they did, Nobara suddenly had to deal with a swarm of curse spirits rushing towards her. Nobara's eyes widened as she realized she was going to have to fight against these cursed spirits. The clone of Mahito looked back and smiled. He completely forgot that Geto was here and on their side. So Mahito stuck his tongue out before running towards the direction he could sense both Yuji as well as his original body at. Meanwhile, Mahito and Yuji were preparing for their next face-off. Mahito still refused to back down, but he could sense that Yuji was completely different in comparison to what he was before. Whatever Yuji had just done, Mahito felt a need, an urge to do it himself. Mahito was going to make sure that he also landed a Black Flash, wondering just what heights they could take each other to. Yuji, on the other hand, was funneling all of his emotions, his anger, his sadness, his regret, everything. He was going to make sure he used everything he could to kill Mahito right here and now. Mahito looking between the several humans he still had. He felt there was definitely something he could do, but he was going to have to be a bit more careful with them. But the time for thinking was done, as both Yuji and Mahito rushed towards each other, closing the distance with Yuji immediately going on the offensive. Mahito, rather than going for direct blocks, was going for redirects. It was funny how both Yuji and Mahito seemed to have a similar weakness to their abilities, where both needed direct hands in order to touch them. However, if their hands never made contact with a part of their body, the technique had significantly less value. Mahito had even gone out of his way to begin to alter his form, trying to take on a form that could allow him to react better, as well as focusing curse energy towards his eyes. He of course knew Yuji was faster, so he needed to make sure Yuji would have as little time to make contact as possible. Yuji, in order to circumvent this, began to use anti-gravity on his own body, using it to make it so blows he was aiming for were harder and harder to predict. Or it looked like he might have been going for a punch to the stomach, he used anti-gravity instead to propel himself a little bit upwards to land a punch on Mahito's chest. Even with Mahito's capability to adapt, it wasn't enough, as it finally allowed Yuji to land another blow, punching him in the chest, before following that up with a punch to the stomach and punching him right into the ground. Sending Mahito tumbling onto his back, he was quick to readjust himself though, forcing himself to get up and just narrowly move out of the way from a punch from Yuji. But as Yuji was preparing to land another punch, suddenly they heard the ceiling break above them, as Mahito's double jumped down and refused with Mahito. Even in spite of that power-up though, Mahito was still forced to block, as he was sent flying backwards with anti-gravity being activated on his body. Mahito was still going to be forced on the defensive, but he had an idea for at least how he could turn it around. As Yuji was about to rush towards him again to close the distance, two small transfigured humans rose out from Mahito's body, before they grew to the size of normal people, and then bloated even further, exploding and covering Yuji's eyes in blood. Mahito knew this attack wouldn't work on him again, so he needed to make sure this worked, as Mahito focused, curse energy surrounding his hand, using the disorientation of the blood to rush right towards Yuji, and land a Black Flash right on Yuji's stomach. He did it. He was able to land a Black Flash, as Yuji was launched towards one of the walls, coughing up a bit of blood while wiping the blood off of his body. As Mahito rushed towards Yuji before yelling out, "See, brat, I can do that too!" But before he could fully close the distance, Yuji reactivated anti-gravity, launching himself even faster than he did before, a determination set in Yuji's eyes. Mahito landed a Black Flash and advanced his own abilities, now operating at 120% of his potential. That much was true. But that only stoked the flames of Yuji to make sure he would land his own, as he landed a second Black Flash, sending Mahito flying right into the ground, and bouncing him into one of the walls. But as he landed, something a little bit different happened. Almost subconsciously, but Yuji had reversed anti-gravity just for one moment. Something that Yuji didn't even notice in that moment. The only person who noticed it was Ryomen's Sukuna. As he smirked a little bit, realizing exactly why his body had adapted that, it was because that was something Sukuna had tested out during his battle with Maharaga and Jogo. But he had no intention to help Yuji out with figuring out why he did that. Before Mahito then fell off of the wall, as he looked towards Yuji, turning his hands into blades. He was not going to lose here. He was not going to die here. Was this what desperation felt like? He had felt an emotion like this before, back when Hanami and Yuji were fighting him together. The core to what allowed him to unlock his domain. Even after Mahito had landed a Black Flash, it wasn't enough. He needed to find more inspiration. But from that same hole that the Mahito double jumped down from, somebody else had managed to arrive. Aoi Todo had landed, as he looked over to his brother, seeing that he had landed 2 Black Flashes, seeing that his curse energy control was far greater in comparison to before, and that they already had Mahito on the ropes. Yuji looked over to Todo as a smile formed onto him, the reminder that he wasn't alone that he needed. Mahito's eyes widened as he saw Todo. This was bad. This was much worse than he thought. He needed some way out of here now. Even if Todo couldn't hit him, it wouldn't matter, because he could make sure Yuji could hit him. Either that or he at least needed to separate them. but he wasn't even sure how he could do that right now. Kenjaku was still watching with an entertained look, curious if he was going to have to interfere or not. As he thought to himself, is this where you die, Mahito? Or is this where you become a different beast entirely? Yuji and Todo just looked at each other and nodded, not needing to exchange any more words. With Nobara being there to help him, and Todo being right there next to him, Yuji's will had been fully repaired. His will to keep fighting, to keep going, was there. Of course, there was still a small part of him that was debating if he was worthy to exist after everything Sukuna did, but right now that didn't matter. Right now he just needed to focus on killing Mahito. Mahito then began to alter his hands, shaping them into blades before rushing at both Yuji and Todo. Yuji at the same time placed a hand onto Todo, activating anti-gravity on him as well, as both of them launched right towards Mahito even faster than before. Mahito's first move was an attempt to land a slash on both of them, but Todo clapped at the last moment, swapping his place with Mahito, causing Mahito to instead slash forward, as Yuji moved in order to punch him in the back, but out from Mahito's back a spike was launched out, forcing Yuji to instead have to move out of the way of the spike. Mahito then saw his chance and attempted to launch 2 more slashes towards Yuji, but Yuji was able to narrowly slide underneath each of them, as he then uppercutted Mahito right into the air, with Todo jumping after him to attempt to kick him back down, but instead he clapped, swapping place with Yuji again, and Yuji punched him straight in the face, sending Mahito into the ground. Mahito wasn't expecting to get ragdolled like this, but then he got an idea, as he activated Body Repel, and began to surround this entire railway in flesh, though it oddly didn't target Yuji and Todo and instead went around them, as Mahito sank into the flesh. Yuji instead quickly put a hand on Todo, activating anti-gravity on Todo's body in order to keep him in the air, though he was making sure to be cautious that he wouldn't hit the ceiling either. Todo right now needed to be careful. He needed to sense wherever Mahito could be. This is a perfect way to land sneak attacks. Even worse, Mahito began to intentionally spike curse energy all across the flesh, using that in order to make sure they couldn't use curse energy to sense where it was coming from. Yuji realized his curse energy sensory would be pointless, so instead he needed to rely on his physical senses. Though this move also had some tax on Mahito, after all it costed him several of his own humans. He knew he couldn't risk a domain expansion, not with Yuji being there, so this was going to be the closest that he could get to doing so. As out from the flesh, while a rocketing fist was sent right towards Yuji, not Mahito himself, no, instead it was a massive fist of flesh, completely surrounded in curse energy in the same size as Yuji, which that caught Yuji off guard, as he lifted up both of his hands in order to block, pushing him back by quite a few meters until he stopped himself on the ground. At the same time, another one of those fists were launched right towards Todo. Thankfully, Todo was already prepared as he kicked it away from himself. But then another one was launched out from the ceiling, punching Todo right back into the ground. But as he was doing so, he saw Mahito begin to rise up. Curse energy focused towards his hands, and at the last moment Todo clapped, swapping his place with Yuji. But this is what Mahito had wanted and expected. Instead of going for an idle transfiguration, he punched Yuji straight in the face. This punch sent Yuji flying backwards by a couple of feet before he used anti-gravity on himself in order to stop himself mid-air. But Mahito saw this as his chance, as he launched himself right towards Todo. Todo smirked a bit as Mahito was about to grab onto him, until Todo clapped, swapping his and Mahito's place, forcing Mahito to instead start falling towards the ground. But at that same moment, Todo focused curse energy to his leg, and landed a black flash right onto Mahito's head. Of course, it did little to no damage on Mahito, but it still sent him flying. However, that was when Todo said, "You made one mistake, Curse, with this move," clapping again, as a part of the floor this time was swapped with Yuji Itadori. "You made an entire tunnel of things that I can swap with." As Yuji focused curse energy towards his fist, Mahito was able to feel that this blow was going to be a black flash. He didn't have much time. As Mahito activated his domain expansion, remembering back to when Gojo used one of 0.02 seconds, knowing that would likely be the only way he'd at least be able to hit Todo, to try to not give Sukuna any time to switch. As the barrier began to expand, but before it could even reach Todo, Yuji landed a black flash, causing a heavy amount of damage to Mahito and launching him upwards, disrupting the process of creating the domain, thus making it fail, launching Mahito out from the ceiling and up to the surface. Mahito coughed up blood as he was launched into a building thanks to anti-gravity. He was too damaged to continue fighting, and he fell, landing on his hands and knees, as Yuji and Todo both jumped upwards, jumping out from the hole and landing in front of them. Mahito was starting to realize that this was it. He was going to die here, as he looked towards the two opponents in front of him. Sure, he still had some transfigured humans left, but he was far too low on curse energy now. More than that, he was far too damaged to continue fighting. However, that was when a swarm of cursed spirits began to attack both Yuji as well as Todo, and someone else approached Mahito from behind. The cursed spirits catch the both of them completely off guard, as Kenjaku placed a hand onto Mahito. "You didn't really meet my expectations, Mahito, but I have ways of making this still work," before using cursed spirit manipulation to absorb Mahito. While this was happening, Nobara took a step out from the subway, finally finishing off all those cursed spirits. A pant coming from her. Understandably, she was rather exhausted. She had to fight a total of 30 cursed spirits, each of them being amped to be equal to grade 1 curses. Still, she was able to sense that Yuji and Todo were still fighting. Even though she didn't have as much stamina as she would like, she knew she had to go back them up. At the same time, Yuji and Todo were both left astonished. They watched as Kenjaku just finished absorbing Mahito. They'd already handled their wave of cursed spirits as well. Though Kenjaku intentionally didn't use too many strong ones, they were mainly just there to stall for him to absorb Mahito, as Yuji yelled at Kenjaku to give them Gojo back now. But as Yuji and Todo were rushing towards Kenjaku, they both felt a familiar feeling. But in particular, Yuji felt a familiar feeling, as Kenjaku activated anti-gravity, and used the reversal of it, slamming both Todo and Yuji into the ground hard. As Kenjaku blinked and chuckled a little bit, saying, "Oh, I guess you have me feeling a little bit nostalgic after all. I was originally planning to use cursed spirit manipulation to hold you down, but I suppose things like these can happen." Yuji and Todo's eyes widened in that moment. How did Geto have a similar curse technique to Yuji? Not just that, it seemed to be the exact opposite of the curse technique that Yuji had. Where Yuji was able to use anti-gravity, Geto was just using gravity manipulation. This made another thought connect in Todo's mind. Could it be possible this was the same technique and he was just using the reversal of it? A potential Todo couldn't dismiss. But no matter what, this all left the same question of why. Why was this the case? Because they all knew Geto's curse technique was cursed spirit manipulation, and you couldn't awaken 2 curse techniques, not without a storage system similar to Yuta Akotsu. This also confirmed it for Sukuna in that moment. Yuji was connected to Kenjaku. After all, that was the exact same application of anti-gravity he was using during their fight. But then all 3 of them felt a surprise. Kenjaku's anti-gravity was supposed to hold Yuji down for 6 seconds, but Yuji used anti-gravity on himself, beginning to force himself up to fight up against it. He was losing right now, but the fact he could even resist at all was impressive, as Kenjaku couldn't help but smirk a little bit. In truth, anti-gravity and gravity system never really seemed that interesting to him. He had always simply taken Kaori's body in order to get close to Jin, but he was realizing that maybe he should have done more research on this technique before simply just dismissing it. However, suddenly he sensed something approaching him at a fast speed, and just at the last moment he was able to narrowly move his head out the way. A nail moved right past his head. As he looked behind himself and saw that Nobara had arrived, and she had launched several nails coming towards him, Kenjaku began to move out of the way. Yuji and Todo in that moment were both able to move as well, as they both rushed towards Kenjaku. And while Kenjaku was moving out of the way with relative ease, Todo suddenly clapped, as he swapped Kenjaku's place of one of the nails, making him move closer to some of the others in the process. And while most of them Kenjaku was still able to dodge, Todo was able to cause some disorientation, allowing one of them to narrowly hit his arm. And he blinked, a little bit impressed by the fact they could actually land a hit on him, as Todo clapped twice, 2 of the nails being swapped, one for Yuji and one for Todo, as they both focused curse energy towards their fists. At the same time, Nobara launched out another wave of nails right towards Kenjaku. But to counter all 3, Kenjaku released a wave of cursed spirits towards each direction, forcing Todo to clap himself and then Nobara backwards in order to counter, but Yuji activated anti-gravity on his own body to float above. Kenjaku looked up as he watched Yuji fly even higher and higher, a slight smile forming on his face as he thought to himself, "I wonder what he'll do next." Until he also saw a nail begin to trace behind Yuji, going high in the air above him. And Todo clapped again, swapping places with that nail and appearing above Yuji. As Todo then launched Yuji right towards Kenjaku, Yuji moving at full speed towards him, and at that moment as well, subconsciously using the reversal of anti-gravity, using gravity to pull him down into the ground even faster, as curse energy focused around Yuji's fist, and he landed a hard black flash right onto Kenjaku's cheek, causing the wave of cursed spirits that were around Kenjaku to all be disintegrated in that moment, and launching Kenjaku back by tens of feet. Todo and Nobara both smiled in that moment as they looked over to Yuji. This was the sign they had a little bit of a chance. They just needed to continue to improve themselves. They needed to force themselves to climb to Geto's level. That caused a laugh to rise from Kenjaku. He didn't expect that today, but he had to admit he was impressed. Spitting out some blood as he looked over to his opponents. You three make an absolutely terrifying team. Thank you for entertaining me so far. Though it was at that moment he sensed something else as he smirked slightly, as he looked up, looking Momo directly in the eyes. As a cascade of arrows were launched right towards Kenjaku, each of them coated in Kamo's curse energy, and that gave Todo an idea. As after all the arrows were done firing, Mai shot a bullet right towards Kenjaku. Kenjaku lifted up his hands to block, but Todo clapped again, swapping the place of one of the arrows with Yuji, as Yuji focused curse energy towards his fist, while at the same time Miwa activated Simple Domain right behind Kenjaku. All the while, Nobara launched 3 more nails towards Kenjaku's back, aiming to corner him completely, but stopping each of them in their tracks. Kenjaku activated anti-gravity again, using the reversal to slam Yuji, Miwa, and the nails into the ground, accidentally also making Miwa's binding vow null and void, by making sure Miwa couldn't land the slash. Before Kenjaku suddenly swapped techniques, Todo could sense the spark in curse energy, as he activated Uzumaki, an Uzumaki infused with Mahito, as he launched it down right towards both Miwa as well as Yuji. Fortunately, Todo at the last moment clapped twice, swapping them with 2 of Kamo's arrows, preventing Kusakabe from having to head in to save them as well, as Panda and Kamo arrived, as well as Choso. Choso right now was shaking with rage, and in that moment revealed that Kenjaku, the man standing in front of them, was his father, and more importantly that Yuji Itadori was his brother. Under normal circumstances, Todo would have questioned this, but considering the technique that Geto was using, that he was using anti-gravity, the reversal of it, it made way too much sense. Yuji was happy for all the others that had arrived at this point. Even with the black flashes he had landed so far, he was still rather exhausted. Between all the applications of anti-gravity he had used, as well as getting used to some new ones, it was really draining him. He felt he needed to use anti-gravity rather sparingly right now, but he felt like their chances might be increasing. However, that was when somebody else arrived, right next to Kenjaku's side, that person being Urame. As Choso first fired a piercing blade right towards Urame's direction, Urame lifting up their hands in order to block, but even so, they could feel the immense power and speed from it, before he began to turn it around, sending it towards Kenjaku's direction. While Choso and Kenjaku were fighting, the others were debating if they should jump in, take advantage of this disturbance. Yuji was the first one up, as he activated anti-gravity on his body to launch himself towards Kenjaku at full speed. But even with that, they weren't fast enough, as Urame activated their curse technique, freezing all of them in a single moment. Aside from Momo, who was too high up to be captured, Yuji fortunately was able to free himself and then Choso. Kenjaku then told Urame, "Don't kill them. I need some messengers to send." With Urame responding Yuji Itadori would be enough, as Yuki then arrived, breaking all the ice falling towards them before Choso's poison activated on Urame, starting to free everybody else. But even with Yuki there to assist them, they weren't able to stop Kenjaku. Even with Yuji's new technique, they weren't able to stop him, as he activated the culling games. Looking over to Yuji in particular as he said, "I expect many great things from you, Yuji Itadori." After the battle in Shibuya, the sorcerers decided it was time to split ways. They each had their own preparations to do. Todo deciding he was going to stay with both Yuji as well as Choso. Nobara told Yuji that she was going to stay in contact with him, make sure that he doesn't die. After all, Nobara knew she needed to be there to make sure that Megumi was going to be okay, or at least she felt she did. And with that, they separated. Yuji, Todo, and Choso heading out to begin eliminating cursed spirits. But now that Yuji had a moment to think, he felt an extra amount of guilt because of anti-gravity. Now that he knew where it came from. But he shook that off. That didn't matter right now. No. What mattered was his ability to be able to help people. What mattered was his ability to be able to kill curses. He was still alive with that purpose, so he might as well figure out how to make this tool as good a tool as possible. Little did they know they were about to be hunted down by 2 sorcerers. Special grade sorcerer Yuta Akotsu, supreme grade 1 sorcerer Naoya Zenin. And it wouldn't be long until their fates intertwined. To both Choso and Todo's surprise while they were hunting down cursed spirits, they noticed that Yuji had already fully managed to recover. Especially Todo, from what he knew, Yuji should have been injured from the Mahito fight, but he did heal himself. Little did they know, the main reason why Yuji had healed himself was because when he was using the reversal of anti-gravity, he accidentally used it on his own body as well, ending up healing himself in the process. Unknown to even Yuji Itadori, he was now capable of using reverse curse technique, though he was aware of something else. Thinking back on it, back at the battle against Noritoshi, he was able to use anti-gravity to slam himself down onto him, but he felt like it was pulling him down. He wasn't using anti-gravity in that moment, he was using gravity. Conceptualizing it was one thing, but actually doing it on purpose again, that was something a lot harder. Still, they were determined to figure out how Yuji even did that. Fortunately, they had several curses they could test it out on until they found the way. Choso in particular was rather surprised by his brother. Of course, he already knew his brother was even stronger than he was. After all, he only managed to win by catching him off guard. But now he was something completely different in comparison to what he was before, and he was only climbing the ladder further and further. One day during one of their hunts of cursed spirits, after Yuji clapped, some cursed spirits began to chase towards him, but this time he figured it out. He finally figured it out how to do it. Each of the cursed spirits were slammed onto the ground hard using gravity manipulation, but he could only keep them there for 2 seconds, more than long enough for Choso to shoot a piercing blood through each of them. And Todo realized why in that moment that Yuji was having such difficulty with using it. He wasn't just using normal curse energy, he was using positive curse energy, a reverse curse technique. Todo was amazed by this. He didn't think his little brother would be able to use reverse curse technique that easily, but at the same time, he expects nothing less from his brother. Choso was also amazed in that moment, both of them congratulating Yuji, though Yuji didn't really feel that way. As Yuji said, "I'm only getting the grasp of it. I haven't mastered it yet. When I master it, then you can congratulate me." Choso then tried to place a hand onto Yuji's shoulder as he told him, "No, you should be proud of yourself right now." However, before Yuji could respond, all 3 of them heard a voice. "I don't see Megami. Am I the first one here? Is that possible that he is that slow?" The man who had arrived was Naoya. All 3 of them instantly looked up to Naoya as he said, "What are you 3 doing? You totally stand out. Don't you want to run? Oh hey, look, it's the clapping baboon." As Yuji questioned why they'd have to run, with Naoya telling them, "Simple, your execution sentence is back on. Though truth be told, my business is with Megami. So I'll start by breaking your legs to make sure you guys can't interfere." Rage began to flare inside of Yuji as he asked him what does he want with Megami, before Naoya vanished, appearing behind all 3 of them, and then saying, "I think I'll have him die. But it'd help if he wrote a little something first." The moment they heard that, the moment Yuji in particular heard that, rage began to boil through. No way was he going to let this man kill Megami. All 3 of them immediately noticed that Naoya was fast. Though Todo already could tell that it wasn't just speed that he had, it was also thanks to his curse technique, projection sorcery. He was now Bito's son after all. Unfortunately for him, Todo was just an awful matchup for him, as right when he was about to try and land a blow onto Yuji, Todo clapped, swapping Yuji and Naoya's places, causing Naoya to hit the air instead. Yuji saw this as his chance, as he was about to try and land a punch onto Naoya, but instead Naoya vanished, moving out of the way. Naoya landing a few meters away from them, and Todo quickly informed both Choso and Yuji on how his technique worked. But then all 4 of them sensed a potent curse energy coming towards them, one that Todo recognized all too well. Yuta Akotsu had now arrived, as Yuta thought to himself, "Damn it, Naoya being here makes things a lot harder for this to work." And after Yuta and Naoya exchanged a few words, they both began their hunts. Todo and Yuji were going to face off against Yuta, while at the same time Choso was going to face off against Naoya. Yuta rushed behind both Todo and Yuji. Yuji immediately rushed over to Todo and placed a hand on him, activating anti-gravity so both of them could go even faster. Yuta was impressed, not just by his speed with thanks to his curse technique, but his speed alone. It was insane. And his curse technique magnified that even further. Yuta considered for a moment if he should just summon Rika right off the bat. But at the same time, he did at least want to test how good the both of them were, as Yuji jumped over a car before turning around and punching it, launching it towards Yuta at full speed, using anti-gravity to make sure it would go even faster. Yuta had no choice but to lift up his hand, surrounding in curse energy and stopping the car right in its tracks. As Yuji and Todo's eyes both widened, Yuji fought back to something that Todo had told him about so long ago. A normal sorcerer focuses curse energy so whatever limb they're going to use to hit you with. Most are unable to conceal it. However, an elite sorcerer is able to conceal it perfectly via keeping their curse energy hidden and controlled. But Yuta had such an immense amount of curse energy it was near impossible to see where it was coming from. He couldn't be telegraphed. Todo and Yuji both nodded towards each other as they both rushed right towards Yuta. Yuta, though, had an advantage that most other sorcerers didn't. He was fully aware of what Todo's curse technique was, though it was going to be unpredictable what Todo was going to do to swap, as Yuji immediately took the charge. At the same time, Todo flipped above, curse energy focusing around Yuji's fist, and Todo clapped. But even though he did, neither Yuji nor Todo's positions were swapped, nor was Yuta's. a fake out, causing Yuta to have a slight delay, allowing Yuji to land a hard punch right onto Yuta's face, activating anti-gravity on Yuta's body, sending him a few feet backwards. But Yuta was able to notice something with that hit. Yuji was holding back a little bit, something that Todo had noticed as well. Yuji didn't want to kill Yuta, he just wanted to not fight him, as Yuji and Todo rushed towards Yuta again. This time Todo was on his right side and Yuji was on his left. Yuta was now focusing on the defenses, as Todo began to clap rapidly, successfully swapping both Yuji and Todo's positions this time as Todo kicked Yuta straight in the chest. At the same time, Yuji attempted to land a punch, but Yuta blocked it. The two of them swapped again. Each time they swapped, it was becoming harder and harder to predict. Sometimes he was swapping Yuta's position, sometimes he wouldn't swap at all, sometimes he was swapping the both of them. And the two of them were able to work so perfectly with each other, Yuta had to admit he was impressed. But so far, he had mainly been working on the defenses. He wanted to get a better idea of what Yuji's curse technique was. That way he'd have more data for when they become allies. And he was pretty confident in his ability to handle the damage. However, he suddenly sensed somebody else rise out, as Rika rose out. One massive hand grabbing onto Todo's entire body, the other hand grabbing onto Yuji, as she said to not hurt Yuta. Both Yuji and Todo's eyes would widen. Todo wasn't able to clap anymore, not while being held back by Rika. Yuji thought about using anti-gravity, trying to use the reversal to slam them into the ground, but that wouldn't work, not with Todo still being held. There was also a pretty good chance he'd be dragged down with Rika, as Yuta in a rather quick moment went behind Todo's head and smacked him in the back of the head, doing that in order to knock him out, before he took out his blade, as he said, "Sorry, Itadori," before stabbing him right through the chest, fortunately activating reverse curse technique on him in order to make sure he stayed alive. And after knocking out Choso, saving Nalia from him, he took the three of them with him to an abandoned building, having Rika carry all three of them. This time, though, Yuji had a dream about his mother, and things began to click. It wasn't his father who was Noritoshi Kamo. No, it was his mother. It wasn't long until the three of them ended up meeting with Tengen. The explanation and plans for the calling games would end up going pretty similar to canon, with Todo deciding he was going to join Yuji and Megami. But in particular, they also dropped off a very important piece of information, that Kenjaku had access to anti-gravity, the same technique that Yuji did, and that gravity manipulation was the reversal of it. Though before they left, Yuki also gave Yuji a solid piece of advice, to look back on what his curse technique was capable of and try thinking bigger with it. He has access to a primordial force in reality. If Yuji pushes himself, who knows what he could end up accomplishing. When he gets back, she might even end up teaching him reverse curse technique and how to use it properly. She could tell he had access to it, he just wasn't that skilled with using it yet. Nothing a bit of training couldn't fix. The battle against Higuruma, as well as the battle against Reggie, are mainly going to go the same. Similar to the recruitment of Hikari, Yuji didn't end up really resisting or fighting back in that battle against Hikari, and I don't see Todo being there really changing much either. The battle against Higuruma just goes much easier for Yuji since he's still going to have curse energy reinforcement, and he's stronger right now than what he should be in canon. However, to have a little bit more fun, there's something else I'm going to do in this. We now head back to the Tomb of the Star. This time the game plan was a bit different. Thanks to them having an understanding of both Kenjaku's curse techniques, they weren't just going to send Choso out to die. When Kenjaku arrived, he'd find Yuki standing there, waiting for him. As Kenjaku then said, "Before we start this battle, I do want to say, I have no anger or animosity towards you. Instead, allow me to show you a possibility to this upcoming affair." Yuki decided to allow him to go through with it, wanting to try and learn as much information about this as possible in case she couldn't stop him. As Kenjaku explained about the purpose of the culling games, the purpose of his plans, how he wanted to optimize curse energy similar to their argument from so long ago. And when Yuki asked why, Kenjaku gave a simple answer of because he was curious. After Yuki gave the signal, several blood orbs began to rise around Kenjaku, supernovas. At the same time, Yuki kicked Garuda, launching them right towards him. But Kenjaku instead activated anti-gravity on himself, using it to launch himself high into the air, in a similar method to how Yuji Itadori had done it. As he said, "I owe my son for opening my eyes on this technique again. To think I almost dismissed it in the past. Still, I will admit, it's nowhere near as good as cursed spirit manipulation." Before underneath him he summoned a cursed spirit, deactivating anti-gravity on himself by extension, using that cursed spirit in order to fly. Choso's eyes widened as he realized exactly what Kenjaku had done. Even though they already had data on how Kenjaku's curse technique worked, Kenjaku now had even more applications to utilize. As he then lifted up his hands and released a massive swarm of cursed spirits right towards both Yuki and Choso's direction. Choso clapped his hands together, rapidly firing out several piercing bloods in order to tear through several of the cursed spirits. Yuki at the same time kicked Garuda forward, launching it through a cascade of them. And while Yuki was able to successfully tear through them, Choso wasn't, as quite a few of them began to push Choso up against the wall. Choso activating Blood Edge repeatedly to stab several of the cursed spirits. However, neither Yuki nor Choso could sense where Kenjaku was hidden. Kenjaku in that moment utilized one of the cursed spirits, the same one that he utilized in order to escape Shibuya, as he rose up right in front of Choso before deactivating cursed spirit manipulation again. You know, it feels pretty good to be able to utilize this curse technique freely, as he focused curse energy right towards his palm striking Choso hard in the stomach, and activating anti-gravity, sending Choso high up into the ceiling at a fast speed, while also winding Choso in a single blow. However, that was when Yuki rushed right towards him, first kicking Garuda high up into the air and launching them right towards Kenjaku. Kenjaku summoning the Ganesha Cursed Spirit, at first attempting to utilize that in order to stop Garuda, but it did nothing, as instead was torn right through, killing the special grade curse with no difficulty as Yuki rushed towards Kenjaku. And Kenjaku had no choice but to block. He wasn't going to be able to activate anti-gravity on time, as Yuki punched him straight through the arms, launching him through one of the walls. Kenjaku then used reverse cursing to heal off his arms, as he slowly got up and decided to call out Yuki, calling out the real reason why she hadn't used her domain expansion yet, because she wasn't confident that she would win a clash. It was even more clear of the fact that they needed Choso to be on the field as well. She wasn't at all confident in her abilities. As Kenjaku opened up his own domain expansion, at the last moment Tengen was able to move Choso out of the way thanks to the barrier. However, Yuki was forced to take it head on, as Kenjaku rushed right towards her as well. Not just did Yuki need to focus on using simple domain in order to fight off cursed spirit manipulation, the sure hit of the domain, but now Kenjaku was also there, up first using anti-gravity in order to launch himself right towards Yuki at full speed, with Yuki being focused on keeping up her simple domain, and it's still breaking nonetheless. She had no way to prepare herself for a block, as Kenjaku landed a hard kick right on her face, disrupting her hold of simple domain, causing the domain itself to directly hit her for a moment before she reactivated it, with things taking even more damage, especially with Kenjaku continuing to be on the offense. She thought for a moment maybe it'd be better for her to directly attack. Her simple domain was going to break anyway, so she rushed towards Kenjaku. But ultimately it was useless, as Yuki was slammed into the ground hard. Once the domain was done, Yuki was left bleeding on the ground, a bloody mess, underneath a large amount of rubble. Maybe if you had used your actual domain, you might have been a little bit more interesting. Though in that moment, Kenjaku saw something odd. He saw Garuda still floating, before Yuki jumped out of the rubble and rushed right towards him. Despite the additional damage that Kenjaku had landed, Yuki was still there fighting, and she didn't even heal herself with reverse curse technique. This was very bad for Kenjaku. His brain and technique were currently on cooldown, as he lifted up both of his arms in order to block an attack, but that wasn't the only thing he had to worry about, as after the blow connected, 3 supernovas rose out around Kenjaku. Additional supernovas they had placed down earlier even before Kenjaku had arrived in order to trap them, and they immediately exploded, causing even more damage onto Kenjaku, pushing Kenjaku back even further before Yuki landed a kick right onto his head. If Yuki wasn't hit by the domain, that would have been enough to kill him, though it still did quite a bit of damage. As Choso dropped down from the ceiling, his hands clapped together preparing to fire a piercing blood right off of Kenjaku's brain. Yuki at the same time used reverse curse sneak on herself in order to fully heal herself off, preparing to join in. While she wasn't able to recover all of its output, she was still able to heal herself a bit. However, Kenjaku spun his brain around, using that trick in order to avoid the piercing blood before moving away from the others, as Yuki picked up Garuda and slammed them hard into the ground, making a massive crater right towards Kenjaku's direction, Kenjaku just barely managing to dodge. They still had a bit more time, they just needed to push forward, as both Yuki and Choso began to push forward on their assault, trying to land one final blow. And that blow connected, finishing off Kenjaku right then and there, disconnecting Kenjaku's head from his body. Thanks to the knowledge to his cursing they had learned about early, they were just barely able to pull out that win, just before he had enough time for his cursing to no longer be on burnout. But things weren't done yet, as Kenjaku activated the Curse Rampage, sending out a massive swarm of cursed spirits right towards them. Yuki activated her own domain expansion in that moment, using that to begin wiping out cursed spirits. As Choso took a seat, looking at the fact they had done it, they had defeated him. They actually managed to do it. His brothers had been avenged. His mother had been avenged. Now all that was left was making sure the Culling Games were a success. Once that was handled, things could truly move on and things could truly live peacefully. We now return back to Tokyo Colony Number 1. The military had just attacked, however fortunately they were able to handle it. Now they were setting up a plan in order to swap Sumiki out of the culling games. After successfully making a deal with the Kogane, things seemed to be going so well. It was a shame that things couldn't remain that way, as Sumiki revealed herself to be another, someone known as Yorozu. Aoi Todo was nearby. He was standing on one of the buildings as guards, nearby Maki Zenin. Both of them were able to sense that something was off, but they couldn't sense what. As Sukuna activated In Chain, using anti-gravity in that moment to amplify his speed even further, knocking out Hana, and before Megumi could even start to try to summon Maharaga, he took his body. Before looking over to Itadori Yuji, and before he could do anything, he punched him straight in the stomach, sending him flying right through several buildings. Before summoning Nue, this Nue was much more massive in comparison to Megumi's, being a fusion of Nue and Orochi, as into lightning bolt down, one on Todo, one on Takaba, and one on Maki. Todo, focusing fast, put curse energy into a rock and threw it, clapping and swapping places with that rock, avoiding the large bolt of lightning. However, Maki and Takaba were forced to take it head on, as they were forced to watch Hana try and use Jacob's ladder on Sukuna, but it simply didn't work. Hana was too far for Todo to clap and move them out the way, resulting in Hana's arm being ripped clean off. Sukuna sensed around for curse energy signatures. While he already knew he couldn't sense Maki, he could sense Todo. But surprise slowly rose onto him as he looked towards the direction of the collapsed building. On the inside was Yuji Itadori, awakened alive. His curse energy was spiking, getting far stronger than it was before. What the hell was happening? He then placed a hand onto a part of the building and activated anti-gravity, before punching a massive part of the building right towards Sukuna. Sukuna's eyes widened in that moment before he lifted up his hand, launching out several slashes in order to cut right through the building coming towards him. This was an application of anti-gravity he was familiar with. It was his own, not Yuji's, but he was using it now? As Sukuna was starting to question what the hell was going on here, before Yuji jumped towards him, moving through the massive dust storm that Sukuna just made by cutting through the building, before using the reversal of anti-gravity on his own body, launching himself down towards Sukuna at full speed and grabbing him by the face, slamming them both through a building. Not just was Yuji's anti-gravity enhanced, his curse energy refinement as a whole was enhanced. He shouldn't have gotten this strong though just from Sukuna separating from him. What the hell was he now? In the Lake Gosho colony, two people were currently present, Kusakabe as well as Nobara. This colony thankfully had been rather easy for them. At best, most of the opponents they were on a grade 1 level, something both Nobara and Kusakabe could handle, but they heard the announcement of a new rule being added to the culling games. Free passage between barriers was now allowed, and that caught the both of them completely off guard. That wasn't their plan. They didn't want to add that rule in first. They wanted to get Sumiki out. Both of them looked to each other and nodded. Something went wrong, and they needed to go now. Sukuna then pointed a finger upwards. He launched out a cascade of slashes right towards Yuji. Yuji was able to sense a spark of curse energy as he activated anti-gravity on himself, launching himself high into the air in order to avoid it, as Yuji landed on one of the walls before pushing himself off of it, launching himself right towards Sukuna. As Sukuna rushed towards him as well, Yuji then activated anti-gravity's reversal on himself, using it instead to pull Sukuna into a hard punch, while at the same time Sukuna landed a punch on his stomach. Under normal circumstances, Sukuna would have been knocked away from Yuji, but thanks to using gravity's reversal, he was being pulled towards him. A similar, albeit not as effective mechanism to Gojo's blue punch. The two of them then landed on the ground, as they both prepared to exchange blows again, but Yuji activated anti-gravity, using that to land a hard punch right onto Sukuna's chest, and activating anti-gravity on Sukuna's body in order to push him backwards even further. Itadori Yuji wasn't supposed to be this strong. Even remnants of his own curse energy inside of him shouldn't make him this much more powerful. There was something else odd that was happening in Yuji. Suddenly, though, massive amounts of concrete was launched right towards Sukuna at a faster speed than he could have expected. He realized in that moment that Yuji had already sped up, as Sukuna punched that concrete, stopping it dead in its tracks, before Yuji, like a missile, was on Sukuna's side already, as he landed a hard punch right onto his cheek, sending Sukuna right towards one of the walls. And as Yuji was about to try and rush at him again, he felt a slash land right on his stomach. Sukuna then said, "I must admit, you have certainly gotten better with the technique, but that doesn't really change anything." Itadori coughed a bit of blood as he asked, "Why? Why can't you just live without causing suffering?" as a more bored expression began to rise into Sukuna, as he then said, "How can a creature that falls apart at a touch say that it always wants to be happy? The helpless have no choice but to swallow the suffering life gives them." As Itadori slowly forced himself up and said, "Then let's see if you can swallow my suffering." Sukuna then lifted up his hand, releasing a large amount of slashes right onto Yuji Itadori. But Sukuna felt a shake in his hand. Not just that, steam was also coming off Yuji. He was healing the wounds. He was healing the slashes, before closing the gap and landing a hard punch right onto Sukuna's face. Not just was Megami on his side, Yuji had now figured out how to use reverse curse sneak to heal himself as well. Even worse, Sukuna sent somebody else arriving, as next to Yuji Itadori, Aoi Todo landed. As Todo pat Yuji on the back before the two of them nodded to each other, without even needing to exchange words, they knew what they needed to do. At the same time, somebody else arrived, Maki. This was bad. This was very bad for Sukuna. He knew Yuji and Todo would be able to fight alongside each other better than anybody. Plus, with Maki being here as well, someone he couldn't sense with curse energy. He needed to find a way to get out of here and fast, especially with Megami's output dropping. Though Maki was slightly concerned, mainly because she wasn't too sure if Todo would be able to keep up with the two of them. However, Todo told them that that wouldn't be a problem for him. So long as his brother kept getting stronger, so would he. He would always be right alongside him to catch up. Yuji at the same time also placed a hand on Todo, activating anti-gravity on him just to make sure he'd be able to keep up. He knew the biggest issue might be physical speed, not mental speed. So with that in mind, all three of them rushed right towards Sukuna, as Sukuna surrounded his body in cursed energy, preparing to face off against all three of them at once. Without even pointing, Sukuna launched out a cascade of slashes at all three of them, though in particular, he was aiming for Todo, while at the same time saying a quick chant. The main reason why he was doing that was because he wanted to interrupt Todo from clapping as much as possible. It didn't matter what type of angles Todo could make if he couldn't clap his hands. Both Todo and Yuji sensed a spark of curse energy, reinforcing the curse energy around their bodies in order to shield themselves from it. Thanks to Megami though, the slash was also somewhat suppressed. And it was only getting worse, as both Yuji and Maki continued to move forwards, while Todo took a jump backwards. Though this is more just as a chance to analyze, as both Yuji and Maki began to release a cascade of blows right onto Sukuna, the two of them moving at dead even speeds, perfectly timing out each other's hits. Maki sensing alterations in gravity, using that in order to know when to land hits, while at the same time Yuji was repeatedly altering Sukuna's gravity, sometimes doing small alterations while sometimes doing big ones. Though that wasn't as effective on an opponent like Sukuna, mainly thanks to his ability to step on air. However, above them, Todo jumped towards them, preparing to kick down towards Sukuna, while at the same time Yuji rushed forward. All while Maki rushed for his other side, preparing to land a punch on him. Sukuna did a quick mental calculation. Maki would be impossible to swap with, so they were out. Which meant Todo had 3 possibilities of what he could be swapping if he claps. Possibility 1, Yuji and Todo swap. Possibility 2, he swaps Yuji and Sukuna's position. Possibility 3, Todo and Sukuna swap, though there was also the possibility he wouldn't swap them at all. From what he could tell, the most advantageous move would be not swapping them at all. This was a feint, and Sukuna was right in his analysis. However, he was wrong about what the intention and plan was, as Maki quickly jumped backwards, and Yuji instead activated the reversal of anti-gravity, slamming Sukuna into the ground hard. But not just that, Todo's kick landed right on the back of Sukuna's head, and with gravity pulling it down, it hit a lot harder, as Todo then clapped, swapping his place with Yuji, moving Todo out from the gravitational field as he jumped back over to Maki. Sukuna's eyes widened. He completely forgot about the reversal, but still, he had to admit he was impressed. Yuji surrounded his fists in curse energy. He was being pulled down to Sukuna. At the last moment, Sukuna activated domain application on his body, using that in order to bypass the anti-gravity, or at least bypass the gravity manipulation. And while he couldn't fully avoid the punch, he was able to somewhat avoid it and move himself out the way. Under normal circumstances, he should have been able to avoid it, but he had to admit he was surprised. That damn brat Megami Fushiguro was making things harder for him than he thought it would be. That was when somebody else arrived onto the field. Urame had now arrived, using maximum output Frost Calm to freeze all 3 of them at once. In particular, their main focus was on Maki, then Yuji, and then Todo. Urame apologized for interrupting as Sukuna summoned Nue. He knew that wasn't going to hold them, especially not with this situation, especially with Megami fighting back the way he was, as Yuji was breaking through the ice, as both Sukuna and Urame jumped onto Nue, and it began to fly away. but Yuji activated anti-gravity on himself, rushing towards the both of them. Steam coming off of his body from the reverse curse technique as rage was fueling him. It didn't take long for Maki as well as Todo to break out as well, as they were chasing after them, but Todo couldn't go the same way Yuji could. Thankfully Maki was able to as she began to hop on air. But Urame didn't let them for a moment, as a massive amount of ice began to launch down towards each of them, while at the same time Sukuna launched out several slashes towards them, nowhere near as effective thanks to how much Megami was reducing his output, but enough to at least begin to push them backwards. As both of them landed on the ground, unable to save Megami. But determination rose for Yuji. He was certain that no matter what, he would save Megami. However, they had something else they needed to do. They needed to get another ally, and fast. It was now time to free Satoru Gojo from the prison realm. Sukuna had just returned back to the Zenin clan headquarters, using it in its curse pit in order to do the bath on his own body, suppressing Megami's soul even further. To sink Megami's soul even further, he decided to kill Yorozu, due to her wielding Sumiki's body, killing Ryu in the process as well. Though after they were done with that, Sukuna and Urame were put in an interesting place. While beginning the merger now was physically impossible due to Tengen still being around, he had access to 359 points, which meant if he wanted to, he could add 3 rules to the culling games. As both him and Urame thought about it for a moment, trying to think and plan on what rules they should add, but at the same time Sukuna also sent Urame out in order to find his remaining fingers. He had a feeling he should prepare for a full power battle. Knowing that he left all of them to prepare, knowing their full determination in mind, he had to prepare himself as well. As a sadistic grin began to rise on Sukuna, he felt he had an idea now on how to do this. Meanwhile, at Jitsu headquarters, everybody was now reuniting with each other, figuring out what their next steps should be. Yuji was happy to see that not just Choso was alive, but Yuki was alive as well. Of course, the first part of their plan was going to be freeing Satoru Gojo. Once they did that, they'd be able to guarantee they had a much better shot at this. At the same time as well, they also prepared Yuji to do something, to consume his siblings. While he felt really strong with his curse technique currently, he did feel the need to get a little bit more power. He wasn't strong enough to beat Sukuna yet. And with that, they began the process of unsealing Satoru Gojo. At first, no one was there, until they felt the very ground underneath them shake, and somebody appeared right in front of all of them. Satoru Gojo was here, and they were all rather happy to see Gojo again. Of course, some for different reasons. Some were happy to see him again because they would solve the problem, some were happy for the security, but Yuji and Yuta in particular were just happy to see him again. Gojo's first question was where was Geto, however Yuki and Choso both informed him that they killed him, which explained why Gojo couldn't sense his curse energy. And that led to a second much more important question, why was Megami not here? And they began to inform Gojo completely about the situation, how Megami's body has been taken by Sukuna. Gojo was tempted to go right then and there, to try and go in order to free Megami from Sukuna, but Yuji and Yuki both told him that wasn't a good idea, not yet at least. They had an idea for something in mind that they were working on, some way to potentially free Megami, and right now they didn't really have a way to do so, but they would soon. And once Gojo heard that, he nodded and understood. For now he was just going to focus on training. However, they were put in a much more different spot from normal. While they were training, they didn't really have a date for when they would be attacking. Thanks to Gojo never having his meet with Kenjaku and Sukuna, he never ended up setting a date between them for when they would fight. This forced them to be on constant watch for whatever Sukuna was doing. They weren't exactly sure what Sukuna was doing right now, but they doubted it was anything good. However, they knew they couldn't rush into things either. With free special grades on their side as well as determined people, they all felt they stood a pretty good chance. Of course, Sukuna was also watching and waiting. He could sense Gojo Satoru's return, and once he was certain his plan would work, that was when he was going to attack. A total of 6 weeks passed since that day. During that time, Yuki and Yuji finally figured out how to potentially reach out to the soul, how to weaken the bath and the connection. Not many of them there would be able to pull off this method, only Yuji Itadori would be able to, thanks to his connection with the soul. They were also able to do some swap training during that time, advancing each of their abilities in preparation for this day. While it could have taken more time if they wanted, they decided now was the time to attack. After all, there was only so much more they could do, and the more time they gave Sukuna, the more and more dangerous he became. During this time, Sukuna was actually a bit more on the quiet side. He had been experimenting with something he felt should be possible in theory for him to do on his own. While what he was doing was unclear, there was one thing clear about it to Gojo though. For some reason, they were going after cursed spirits. This when Sukuna asked the Kogane if it was possible to delay a rule being added to the culling games. The Kogane stated that so long as the points were given already in exchange, then that should be fine. So with that, Sukuna did create a rule, however he intentionally chose to not have the Kogane activated yet, as he had an idea to lure Gojo out. He went towards an abandoned city, and released a cascade of slashes, however each of them were aimed, and they had one purpose, to write out a message for Gojo. You have 2 minutes to arrive to Shinjuku in order to battle me. For every 1 minute that you're late, I will destroy an entire city. And now all of their hands were forced. But still, with his extra time to prepare, they felt they stood a pretty good chance against Sukuna, or at least they hoped so. Unfortunately, even with the extra time they had to prepare, even with having both Yuki and Nobara on their side as well, they weren't able to change the outcome of Gojo versus Sukuna. And even more than that, Sukuna using the world-cutting slash to finish off Gojo. However, they felt that things were going to go easier from this point onwards. Gojo was dead, but Sukuna was the only opponent they had to focus on. Though Kashima wanted to go first, he wanted to fight against Sukuna alone. And since he was so insistent on it, they were going to use this as a chance to scout things out. Maybe they could get more information through Kashima, leading to that battle playing out mostly the same as well. However, there was one difference. Urame did not interfere. Instead, Sukuna had retrieved Kamutoke. Since he was the one who got to choose the time of when this happened, he set up the battlefield how he liked. Yuji and Higuruma were on the field. Todo was also teleported nearby, just in preparation. However, when both of them landed, they got a new alert from the Kogane. A new rule has been added to the Culling games. Cursed items and tools can now be transferred over to other players, so long as the cursed item belongs under said player's ownership. Yuji and Higuruma's eyes widened for a moment, questioning why this was the case, but they couldn't focus on that for too long. They just had to rely on Yuta and the others to be able to figure out what was going on, as Yuji activated anti-gravity on himself and rushed right towards Sukuna, with Higuruma going right behind him. At that time, Urame was also doing their own preparations. During the 6-week gap, they decided to make more cursed tools, specifically similar in structure to how Sukuna's fingers worked. Of course, they weren't going to be anywhere near as potent as Sukuna's fingers, but they would serve their intended purpose, to amplify curses. During the 6-week period, Urame had been looking for curses, planting them in different barriers, as they began to utilize that new rule that was implemented, and amplified several cursed spirits to make them stronger. The others were all preparing teleport in order to give backup in order to allow Higuruma to land a stab with the Executioner blade, but suddenly they were getting reports. Stronger cursed spirits were starting to surface as well. They were going to have to reorganize a bit. Fortunately, they did have some additional special grades on their side, so they felt they had a pretty good chance at this. Once the domain was cracked, Yuta and Yuki would join into the fight. Maki also would need to stay by in order to catch Sukuna off guard, and Choso in order to act as additional support. Finally, thanks to Kusakabe's skill in simple domain, he would also be staying by for support. Aside from that, everybody else now had the role of taking out curses, but they need to stay on guard just in case. If Wee teleported over to them, he would bring them over. They all understood the plan. As they saw on the screen, Higuruma's domain faded. Higuruma was wielding the Executioner blade, and Yuji was right there in order to back him up. Nobara also decided that she was going to stay behind. As much as she would have been good help against curses, she knew she might have to bail them out against Sukuna and his finger, especially considering she could technically attack him from any range thanks to the binding vow she had in mind. Back on the battlefield, Higuruma's domain faded. At that same time, 4 sorcerers were teleported down. Yuki Tsukumo, Yuta Akotsu, Kusakabe, as well as Choso had now all arrived. However, only Higuruma and Sukuna realized that what was confiscated from Sukuna was Kamutoke, as Sukuna released a slash towards all of them, cutting into their body. In particular, Choso having the hardest time dealing with it due to being the weakest one here, or the one with the weakest counter. Yuji, Yuta, as well as Yuki were able to reinforce their curse energy to defend themselves. Kusakabe activated Simple Domain in order to shield Higuruma. Todo was also waiting nearby. He was waiting for the perfect opportunity. Now the Executioner blade was on the field. He just needs to be careful. And all the sorcerers began their push forward. They needed to make an opening for Higuruma to land the Executioner sword. That was going to be their best chance to win. Yuji activating anti-gravity both on himself as Higuruma, in order to make sure they can move at their maximum speed. Sukuna was currently analyzing everyone here. Even though Todo hadn't shown himself, he was certain that Todo was somewhere here. Higuruma was the only person with the ability to kill him, though he also knew he had to be ready to activate domain amplification at a moment's notice. If Yuji activated the reversal of anti-gravity on his body, it would be game over, because it would be that much easier for Higuruma to stab him. Yuta Kotu, thanks to his copy technique, was also going to be annoying. And then finally there was Yuki Tsukumo. All he knew about her was the fact that she had a Shikigami and high amounts of physical power. He had no idea what her curse technique was. He had relative confidence he could handle both Choso and Kusakabe. They weren't too powerful, but they would still be annoying gnats to have to deal with. So Sukuna started by putting his hand on the ground, activating Cleave Spiderweb, creating a massive smoke screen around himself in order to cloak his location. Immediately right off the bat, he launched out a powerful slash right towards Yuta Akotsu. Rika's arms manifested in front of them in order to block the slash, but still it pushed Yuta back quite a bit. As Yuji and Higuruma both rushed forward towards Sukuna, finding him, Higuruma attempting to stab the Executioner Blade into Sukuna, while Yuji attempting to land a punch on him. Sukuna pointed one of his fingers forward, using that in order to launch a slash towards Higuruma, while at the same time grabbing Itadori by the neck and throwing him a distance, kicking him in the stomach as he did so. Itadori took that moment in order to punch his arm, using the technique from before in order to start weakening the connection of the soul, as Yuji forced himself to stop midair. And he then swapped curse techniques, going over to blood manipulation. Both him and Choso clapped their hands together. Yuji Itadori's third swap was with Kamo, resulting in Kamo having access to reverse curse technique, and resulting in Yuji Itadori having access to a much greater handle on blood manipulation. As two piercing bloods were launched on Sukuna's sides, Sukuna was actually caught a little bit off guard by that. He wasn't expecting Yuji to be capable of using piercing blood, as he was really starting to question what they did during this time in order to train. Still, it was no matter, as he lifted up two of his hands, releasing a slash towards both of the piercing bloods and equaling them out. Not just equaling them out, but cutting right through them. Yuji swapping back over to anti-gravity, while at the same time Choso activated Flowing Red Scale, both of them using those techniques in order to move out of the way. Which was when both Kusakabe and Yuki rushed forward, Yuki aiming to land a punch on Sukuna's chest, while at the same time Kusakabe aimed to activate Simple Domain to slash on his back. Sukuna aimed one of his arms towards Yuki, not seeing Kusakabe as someone he would need to aim a slash at, as he equaled out Kusakabe's slash, while at the same time launching one right down towards Yuki. But Yuki ended up healing off the slash, still moving forward as she attempted to land a punch on Sukuna, but Sukuna lifted up one of his arms to block. However, as he did that, he could feel the immense weight behind that punch, the power, the mass. Even with Sukuna's immense amount of curse energy, it ended up breaking his arm and sent him flying to the side by a couple of feet. Sukuna hopping off air in order to stop himself as he blinked before using reverse curse technique on his arm. He could see that whatever this woman's curse technique was, he couldn't allow them to hit him. They were much stronger than he thought. Todo was right now stuck watching this. Trying to figure out a perfect opportunity to swap Sukuna in was going to be difficult. He did consider for a moment if maybe he should instead rush towards Higuruma and swap himself with Sukuna, both Sukuna being aware of the fact that he was alive as well as the fact that Higuruma had the Executioner's Sword. He doubted that Sukuna was going to have his eyes or sensory off of Higuruma for even a moment. A movement like that would allow Sukuna to have time to prepare. He needed to rely on the others being able to get close enough to Sukuna for him to swap them with Higuruma. Both Sukuna's ability to launch out slashes without even making a hand sign, that was significantly harder said than done. They did still have Nobara, but they wanted to use that as their ace in the hole just in case. However, that was when somebody else began to arrive as well, Urame. Normally Hikari would have come with Kashimo in order to stall out Urame, but since Urame wasn't present, Hikari ended up going back to base, and was now currently helping with clearing out cursed spirits. All the sorcerers here would be able to sense Urame's presence, and with that they made an adjustment. As Yuki told Yuta, "I'll be right back." She knew she had more than the physical power to handle someone like Urame, as Urame released a massive cascade of ice shards right down towards everybody, with the goal of making a battlefield that was much harder to traverse through. As Kusakabe followed behind Yuki, both Yuki and Kusakabe were going to handle Urame, while at the same time everybody else would have to handle Sukuna. Yuta was realizing he was likely going to have to resort to that. He knew Todo was on the field as well. So Yuta told Yuji to rush forward with him. They had both been having to dodge against several of the ice shards coming towards them, but thankfully they were getting more and more adjusted to them. Choso at the same time was also getting ready to follow behind them, as Sukuna rushed right towards Higuruma and punched him in the stomach, sending him right over to one of the urban areas. And right when Sukuna launched a slash towards Higuruma, both Yuji and Yuta moved in the way, Yuji using anti-gravity in order to both amplify his own speed as well as Yuta's, both of them shielding him from the slash. As Choso nearby clapped his hands together and fired out a piercing blood for Sukuna's head, but Sukuna fired out a slash himself, cutting right through the piercing blood. But now that everybody was in the same area, Yuta decided that now was the time, as he put on the ring, making sure to go all out as he activated his domain expansion. Yuki and Kusakabe both began their rush on Urame. They knew quite well if Yuki could land a few hits on Urame, they'd more than likely be dead considering how effective it was on Kenjaku. But at the same time, Urame also knew that as they watched Yuta's domain form over the rest of the group in Sukuna. Urame needed to be careful. They couldn't allow Yuki to hit them. They just needed to keep at a range. But thankfully, that was their way of fighting. So they knew they stood a pretty good chance at winning this fight. Though Urame was lacking knowledge on how her cursed technique worked fully, Urame knew that Yuki wielded a great amount of power, but not how the technique worked. After all, Kenjaku died and they only really saw them use it once in order to break all of their ice. But either way, no matter what, they had to avoid them, as they launched a massive cascade of ice shards right towards the both of them. But Yuki began to rapidly break through each of them, while at the same time Kusakabe activated Simple Domain in order to slice through each of them that were coming towards him. But once they landed, Urame activated Maximum Output Frost Calm, releasing a massive cascade of ice towards all of them in order to attempt to freeze them. Kusakabe was able to activate Simple Domain in order to shield himself, however Yuki ended up getting fully frozen over by the wave of ice. A smirk rose onto Urame as they said, "Well, that should buy me a little bit of time," before they heard the ice begin to crack and break, as Yuki shattered the ice around her completely, turning it into nothing more than shards. The steam of her curse technique rising off her body for the small part she did need to heal. As she then summoned Garuda and said, "I don't think I'm a fan of all of this running." As Yuki then calls Garuda before Garuda shaped into that of a ball, and she kicked them right towards Urame's direction. Urame quickly made a pillar of ice underneath them, mainly so they could avoid the hit. But they felt the pillar be completely cut through and shattered thanks to Garuda, as Yuki jumped up towards them. Urame did a quick chant as well as they released a wave of ice, using that in order to block the punch coming towards them, but even with it being amplified by the chants, Yuki was able to completely shatter through it. As Urame was launched back downwards towards the ground, causing them to groan a bit as Kusakabe appeared behind them and activated Simple Domain, landing a hard slash right on their back. If Kusakabe was being honest, he much preferred fighting Urame than he did Sukuna. But either way, he wasn't going to dilly-dally. He wanted to take Urame out as fast as possible, as he prepared to land another slash right onto Urame's neck. But Urame at the last moment was able to activate their curse technique, releasing a large wave of ice in order to counter Kusakabe's slash. Still, Urame didn't go overboard with that wave of ice. They knew they needed to focus 100% of their effort on fighting Yuki. Which, speaking of Yuki, was rushing right towards them again, a large amount of curse energy surrounding their fist. As Urame smirked a little bit, they were making their move way too obvious, or at least that was what they were thinking, until that curse energy swapped locations, now going to her leg in order to push her forward much faster. Yuki now near instantly closing the gap between the two of them. Urame should have realized that was a fake out. Yuki was one of the few sorcerers who didn't need to use that much curse energy in order to amplify her blows thanks to her curse technique. While Urame wasn't aware of what the technique was yet, they were aware it had something to do with damage amplification. It made their hits hit harder, but they weren't sure how or what. As Urame quickly made a burst of ice underneath their feet, they knew they weren't likely going to be able to avoid all of the blow, resulting in Yuki completely punching off their leg. And Urame focused curse energy towards their leg in order to start regenerating it, but that was a mistake, as Kusakabe activated Simple Domain again, surrounding their blade completely in curse energy. A battle between sorcerers never came down to who was stronger, who was faster, who had a better technique. It always came down to the fault of the sorcerer, and the other sorcerer who was able to exploit it. As Kusakabe eliminated Urame by slicing off their head. They were far too focused on the main threat being Yuki, understandably so. After all, no one would be focused on a grade 1 sorcerer like himself. Both Yuki and Kusakabe nodded to each other. They didn't have much time. They needed to get right back to the others in order to help them. Yuta Okotsu opened up his domain expansion, bringing in Yuji Itadori, Higuruma Hiromi, Choso, as well as Ryomen Sukuna. Sukuna immediately activating Hollow Wicker Basket on his body. He didn't know what this sure hit was, but he had to be prepared. As Yuta activated Jacob's Ladder on the domain, they were going to have to weaken Sukuna in order to allow Higuruma to land the Executioner Blade. But with a team of 4 of them here, they felt that should very well be possible. Nobara, meanwhile, was currently on standby, ready to activate her technique at a moment's notice and watching just in case. They needed to wait, though. They needed to wait for the perfect opportunity in order to make sure they could win, as Yuji activated anti-gravity on both himself and Higuruma. The point of this rather clear, to allow them both to be able to reach Sukuna as fast as possible. As Sukuna looked towards the both of them and focused, he knew for a fact he couldn't let either of them get close. Yuji, because the more and more Yuji would hit him, the harder it would get for Sukuna to be able to dodge, but Higuruma as well, because Higuruma was the key to him dying. He had to admit this was certainly a rather interesting scenario that he found himself in. As a smile slowly rose onto him, it had been a long while since he had been pressed like this, not by someone who was strong enough to rival him, no, by some group of people. As his curse energy began to rumble throughout the area, they could feel it. His interest was spiking. Before he told them, "Come, give me your best shot." All four of them could sense that massive spike of curse energy. Sukuna was now going to be fighting even harder than he was before. But still, they knew they couldn't back down. If anything, this just fueled their own determination, their own fires. Yuta picking up one of the swords, while at the same time Yuji rushed right towards Sukuna. Higuruma chasing after them but letting Yuji and Yuta lead, while at the same time Choso began to scatter blood all across the area. Yuji was the first to close the gap, using anti-gravity to his advantage in order to land a hard punch right onto Sukuna's cheek. At the same time activating anti-gravity on Sukuna's body in order to have him float up in the air for a couple of seconds, as Yuta rushed for his other side, while at the same time Rika slammed both of their fists down hard on Sukuna. Sukuna lifting up one of his hands in order to stop Rika's slam, but the technique that Yuta had imbued into that blade was sky manipulation, as he activated Fin Icebreaker, hitting Sukuna right across the chest, causing Sukuna to be launched backwards. Yuji activated anti-gravity on his own body again, launching himself towards Sukuna, before placing both of his hands together and activating the reversal of anti-gravity. At the same time, Higuruma rushed behind him. This was a perfect trap. This could potentially finish him off. But Sukuna saw this coming, as he released a quick chant from his stomach mouth. He didn't have anywhere near enough time to actually complete the world-cutting slash. However, he did have enough time to make a powerful slash in order to launch Yuji backwards, distracting Yuji and making him lose focus on keeping him down with anti-gravity, hitting Yuji hard in the stomach and cutting rather deep into him, while launching him tens of feet backwards. If it wasn't for the experience he already had gained about reverse curse technique, as well as the swap training he did with Choso and the swap training he did to refine his own reverse curse technique, this would have gone very bad for him. But still, thanks to all of that, he was able to heal the wound, but at the same time Higuruma was rushing towards Sukuna, leading to Sukuna flipping off air, and instead grabbing Higuruma by the face and slamming him hard into the floor of the domain, causing Higuruma to cough up some blood, and as he was about to attempt to stab the Executioner's sword into his arm, Sukuna sliced off his own arm before jumping backwards, using Reverse Curse Nick to heal back the arm. Not bad. My Reverse Curse Nick is still a bit sloppy, but I'll be able to make this work. Yuta looked over to Yuji, mainly to check on him, but Yuji gave him a thumbs up. He was currently alright. They both had to acknowledge in that moment this was not going to be easy for either of them. They were going to need to focus harder than they ever had before. And right as Sukuna was about to begin rushing towards Higuruma again, several blood orbs began to rise around him. Supernova. At the same time, Choso released a quick chant, before each of the supernovas exploded at an even higher potency in comparison to normal, giving Higuruma just enough time in order to move out of the way from below from Sukuna. Yuta right now knew they had one out to this, one chance they could win. He needed to get Inumaki's curse technique. That would effectively guarantee their victory, or at least he thought that, but Sukuna likely would be able to counter it, wouldn't he? With curse energy around his ears. That was what they were going to have to gamble it on. As both Yuji and Yuta nodded to each other again, before continuing on their rush, Yuji activating anti-gravity on both himself and Yuta this time in order to get their full speed, Yuta on the way there picking up one of the swords. It wasn't cursed speech this time either, but the moment they reached, Yuji swapped techniques, instead going with blood manipulation in order to activate flowing red scale stack, using the momentum from anti-gravity in order to stack his blow. While he knew it was impossible to activate both the techniques at the same time, it was still possible to take advantage of the state that anti-gravity left his body in, as he did a hard punch right onto Sukuna's head, while at the same time Yuta aimed the blade, as he activated Dismantle right onto Sukuna's hand, cutting off one of the hands, before his other hand attempted to go for Sukuna's stomach mouth, grabbing onto his tongue. Sukuna pointed a hand downwards, prepared to launch a slash towards Yuta, but Yuji activated anti-gravity on Sukuna's body again, using it in order to cause Sukuna to float slightly upwards, while Yuta focused a large amount of curse energy towards his hand, and used it in order to yank out the stomach tongue, but he still ended up getting hit by the slash. However, part of it did miss thanks to anti-gravity. They needed to eliminate all of Sukuna's abilities off the board. Yuji then jumped upwards, activating anti-gravity on himself, using it in order to launch himself. No, he wasn't launching himself, he was controlling it, using it in order to fly above Sukuna. He was utilizing Sukuna's methods now, before he swapped over again to blood manipulation in order to utilize flowing red scale stack, and he slammed both of his fists down hard into Sukuna's back in order to slam him back into the ground. He was getting better at swapping his techniques on the fly, but Sukuna quickly turned around, as he was about to launch slashes towards Yuji's direction, but a hand moved in front of them, a massive cursed spirit, Rika. They were moving to shield Yuji. Thanks to a mix of how much Yuji had nerfed Sukuna by this point, as well as Rika's innate durability, Rika was able to successfully block the slashes from Yuji and shield him. Both Choso and Yuta immediately took their chance though, as Choso fired a piercing blood right towards one of Sukuna's hands, aiming specifically for the one that was currently holding Hollow Wicker Basket. At the same time, Yuta rushed towards Sukuna with a new katana in hand, aiming to land a slash on him. Sukuna fortunately was able to launch out slashes without even needing to move his hand, as he launched out several slashes in order to clash with the piercing blood. While he was able to cut through it, he wasn't able to send the slashes fully over to Choso. At the same time, he surrounded his own hand in slashes, using that immediately in order to clash with Yuta's blade. But that was when the technique infused into the blade activated, Drew's Shikigami, as several of them slashed into Sukuna's body. As Sukuna kicked Yuta away from him and the two of them landed on the ground, he was still able to heal off those wounds using reverse curse technique, but it took a little bit for him to heal. The effects from his battle against Gojo Satoru, as well as the effect of Yuji weakening the barrier between Megami and his own soul, were all starting to add up together now, hindering Sukuna greater and greater, something all four of them were able to see. Right now they had two plans. Their first plan was to continue weakening Sukuna, and potentially get Sukuna to a weak enough place where Higuruma can land the Executioner's sword on him, and their second plan was for Yuta to get Cursed Speech through his domain. If they could get either of those circumstances to happen, it would be game over for Sukuna. Sukuna had some idea of what they were going for, and he wasn't going to allow that to happen, as his four eyes scanned the area, before eventually locking into Higuruma. And he went full speed, heading right for Higuruma's direction. But before he could reach, he felt a pull on his back, as he was suddenly pulled right back to Yuji's direction. Yuji, similar to how Sukuna used anti-gravity on two buildings against Jogo, used it on Sukuna's body in order to pull him right towards him. Sukuna immediately recognizing that usage of anti-gravity, his own usage, as both Yuji and Yuta rushed towards him at the same time. Sukuna just narrowly activated domain amplification in order to nullify this usage, at the same time keeping up his Hollow Wicker Basket. But he was too late anyways, as Yuji activated Flowing Red Scale Stack, swapping techniques. At the same time, Yuta picked up one of the katanas. And the technique imbued into that katana wasn't the one he wanted, but it was one he could certainly make work. Yuji landed a hard punch right into Sukuna's chest, weakening his output even further. But at the same time, Yuta aimed one of his punches towards one of the hands using Hollow Wicker Basket. And not just did he completely shatter that arm, he sent Sukuna flying backwards. The technique he had just copied was Yuki's technique. Sukuna, realizing his virtual mass had just increased as he was sent flying backwards. Sukuna quickly used one of his other hands in order to recreate Hollow Wicker Basket, a second before Yuta could activate the sure hit of the domain on Sukuna again, as he began to heal off his other arm, starting to regenerate it. But even then, that was going to take some time with how weakened his RCT was. In that moment, one of the King of Curse's eyes locked onto Yuta Akotsu. He couldn't believe he was being pushed hard like this, as realization struck him in that moment. In order for him to win, he was going to need to utilize the world-cutting slash. Yuji's ability to weaken the soul was even more powerful than he had expected, benefits that must have come from having that much time to repair. On top of that, he didn't know what Yuta's sure hit was. But if he kept letting them go, if he kept letting them fight, things were going to get very dangerous for him and fast. A full output dismantle might be enough, but at the same time he wasn't too sure. On top of that, he wouldn't be able to grab onto either of them for long enough to use cleave, especially to the necessary output that would be required to kill them, not to mention the reverse curse technique. But then suddenly he sensed a new curse energy signature enter into the domain, one he was not expecting, and he just narrowly managed to move out of the way from Garuda being launched right towards him. Yuki Tsukumo and Kusakabe had now joined them in the domain, telling Sukuna that Urame was now dead. With 3 special grade level opponents as well as 3 grade 1 level opponents on the field, this now became much more difficult for him to handle. On top of that, he was well aware that the Zenin hadn't shown up yet, the one that had 0 curse energy, and they were already pressuring him like this. A thought entered into his mind, a simple question: was he going to lose? Between all of their abilities, he was truly being put into a corner. Not to mention the damage Gojo Satoru had already done before this battle had started. But that moment, that question of if he was going to lose, it was so against who Sukuna was. It gave him a spike of motivation. His will began to strengthen in that moment. His interest had already spiked as well. As a result of that, his curse energy was spiking. Ryomen Sukuna was not the strongest because he was born with 4 arms and 2 mouths. Ryomen Sukuna was not the strongest because he had a near boundless amount of curse energy. What made him the strongest was the fact that he was Ryomen Sukuna. If there was an ability he currently didn't have the tools to fight against, he would figure it out. He would create the tool to fight against it. With 6 of them now present in the domain, they knew they had a much better chance, as Yuta picked up 2 of the katanas. Choso clapped his hands together, preparing to fire off a piercing blood. Yuji activated anti-gravity on his own body in order to launch himself towards Sukuna. Kusakabe was going for his back alongside Yuki, and Higuruma was going for his other side, aiming to stab the Executioner Sword right into him. Sukuna casted a binding vow in that moment, as he released his hands performing Hollow Wicker Basket, knowing full well he was going to get hit by Jacob's Ladder. Yuta and Choso both saw they didn't have much time, as Choso fired out the piercing blood as fast as he could, while at the same time Yuta activated one of the katanas, being Shrine, launching out slashes right towards Sukuna's direction. From what they could tell, Sukuna had free chants he needed to say in order to cast the world-cutting slash. Their attack should be able to hit before Sukuna gets to the third chant, and while their assessment was right, it had one major flaw. As he said, Scale of the Dragon, Twin Meteors, making the Enmanten hand sign, and at the same time, pointing right towards Yuta Akotsu, while at the same time launching a cascade of slashes toward everyone in the domain at once, as the world-cutting slash cut right through Yuta Akotsu, cutting him in half. The binding vow that Sukuna made was rather simple. In exchange for only needing to do 2 of the chants this time, every other time he wanted to cast the world-cutting slash, he only had a 6-second window that he could complete the chants within. If those 6 seconds were interrupted, Sukuna's world-cutting slash would fail to be activated. Though he did not get out of this unscathed, thanks to Jacob's Ladder did manage to successfully weaken the barrier between his and Megami's soul even further. And while the slashes did succeed in pushing most of the attacks as well as them away, 2 were able to move through. 2 people insane enough to ignore the pain. Yuki Tsukumo, who landed a punch right on the arm that Sukuna was trying to use to point at Yuta, though she was too late, while at the same time Yuji focused, and landed a black flash right onto Sukuna's stomach. Used that in order to restore his output in order to heal him fully, and even further weakening the connection between Sukuna and Megami, as Sukuna on instinct began to hop off air, trying to avoid them, but at the same time Yuji intentionally activated anti-gravity in order to make him go a little bit higher. Sukuna was being pushed right now that he barely even noticed, as Maki jumped up towards his back and stabbed Sukuna right through the stomach, purposely going for the stomach mouth in order to make it much harder to regenerate and take that piece off the board. This was also the perfect distraction in order to allow Rika and Yuta to escape. Within the sparks of black, though, Yuji was able to feel something manifest inside of him. He had awakened. He had awakened to a brand new understanding. An understanding of both his blood manipulation and his anti-gravity. But more than that, he could feel something manifesting inside of him. Shrine had now awakened as well, though there was quite a mental toll for having 3 techniques in his brain at once. Most sorcerers wouldn't be able to handle such a thing. However, Yuji Itadori was adjusting. Plus, if it was just pain, it wouldn't stop him. Even though Yuta Akotsu was no longer on the field, they now had Yuki Tsukumo as well as Maki in order to assist. More than that, the plan with the Executioner's Sword was still available thanks to Higuruma being present, and Yuji could feel just how much he had weakened the connection between Megami and Sukuna's soul. Sure, Sukuna had managed to pull off removing one of their pieces off the board, but they knew quite well that Sukuna was still limited himself. But all of them also knew well to be wary. Even in this heavily damaged state, Ryomen Sukuna was still the king of curses, still the strongest and still an absolute monster to worry about. Especially considering they could see the interest, the intrigue in Ryomen Sukuna's eyes continue to increase. He especially grew happy seeing Maki here. Maki, after all, was the one he wanted to battle the most out of everyone here, even more than Higuruma Hiromi. Now, he needed to remove some of the pieces off the board, as his eyes slowly locked onto Choso and Kusakabe, simply saying, "Next." As Sukuna then released a cascade of slashes in all directions, going for everyone in order to separate them. Kusakabe activating Simple Domain in order to deflect the slashes away from himself, but even with Simple Domain he was still pushed backwards. Higuruma directed Curse Energy towards the front of his body, using that in order to shield himself from the slashes. But even then, that wasn't enough. He still ended up taking some damage from it. Choso similarly lifted up both of his arms in order to block, taking some cuts on his arms and legs and pushing him backwards, as he used reverse cursing in order to heal off the blow. Both Maki and Yuji were able to use their abilities in order to hop in the air, use that in order to avoid the slashes, while at the same time Yuki attempted to rush towards Sukuna instead. But she was slowed down by the slashes she was taking, forcing her to have to heal those off. As Sukuna directed his direction towards Choso, quickly kicking Yuki in the face in order to launch her away from himself before she could reach, taking advantage of the fact he had more reach, while at the same time focusing Curse Energy towards his feet in order to launch himself, using Yuki as a launch pad to launch himself right towards Choso. Now pumping Curse Energy towards his heart in order to continue its healing, while at the same time he's focusing reverse cursing to his arms in order to begin healing them back. However, this process was slow thanks to all the damage he had taken up to this point, as both Yuji and Maki launched themselves towards Sukuna as well, trying to reach him on time, but even with that, Sukuna was still just barely fast enough. as he punched Choso hard in the chest, knocking him through one of the buildings. As he focused slashes around one of his hands, using that in order to clash with the Soul Split Katana, while at the same time clashing fists with Yuji. That was when Yuji spun his body around mid-air, before he activated Anti-Gravity's reversal technique. But he didn't do it on Sukuna. Instead, he was doing it on himself to pull himself even faster towards the ground. Before Yuji fully could make contact with the ground, he swapped techniques. The gravity no longer pulling him, but instead he swapped over to Shrine, placing a hand right onto Sukuna's stomach and landing several cuts right onto him, using Cleave. But not just that, he was able to target even deeper into the soul, causing even more damage to the connection, as he quickly lifted up both of his arms, swapping back over to blood manipulation in order to strengthen his defenses and block a kick from Sukuna straight to the face. Maki then flipped backwards off of the air before rushing right for Sukuna's left side, at the same time Yuki rushed for his right side. Sukuna knew neither of them were people he would want to risk getting hit by. He experienced Yuki's physical power head-on, and at the same time he also knew Maki's blows were hard to regenerate from in his state. As Sukuna quickly said a chant, not enough to cast the world-cutting slash of course, but enough to at least launch out a much more powerful dismantle, launching it right towards Yuki's direction, forcing her backwards, forcing her to lift up her arms in order to block and heal from the attack. She noticed it had much more power. However, thanks to the state that Sukuna was currently in, they couldn't really operate at full power, as he then focused slashes right towards his hand, using that in order to start clashing against the Soul Split Katana, as he focused reverse cursing to one of his arms in specific. While Maki was impossible to sense through curse energy thanks to not having any, that was also a disadvantage. She wasn't able to sense when he was healing, as Sukuna blocked one of Maki's slashes but at the same time regenerated his arm, using that in order to land a hard punch right onto Maki's stomach, before grabbing her hard by the face and throwing her right into the parking lots of one of the buildings. Sukuna contemplated for a second who he should go for first, Higuruma Hiromi or Maki, both were people he was rather curious about, but he ultimately decided on going for Maki first. Higuruma he'd always be able to sense through curse energy. Higuruma would never be able to land a sneak attack on him. Maki on the other hand he was always going to need to keep his eyes on no matter what. Speaking of sensory, he sensed Kusakabe, Yuji, as well as Higuruma all coming towards him at once. As he focused curse energy towards his legs, he pointed two of his arms behind himself and launched himself right towards Maki's direction, at the same time quickly doing a series of 2 chants, launching out enhanced slashes towards all 3 of the people coming towards him. Kusakabe had to focus even more curse energy than normal in order to deflect it. Yuji was able to activate anti-gravity on himself in order to fly out of the way, quickly grabbing Higuruma as well to take him with him so they would both dodge, as Maki got herself back up before seeing Sukuna come right towards her and close the distance. Slashes surrounded Sukuna's upper and lower arms, forming them into blades, as he slashed down right onto Maki. While he made that simple movement, he cut through parts of the building. Maki lifted up her blade in order to counter, but as she did, 2 curse energy infused punches landed straight on her stomach, winding Maki for a moment before Sukuna grabbed her by the face, activating Cleave directly on her, before Sukuna threw Maki directly towards one of the cars. But Maki flipped off air, using it in order to land on the other side of the car and stop herself before she grabbed onto the car and threw it right towards Sukuna. Sukuna launched a horizontal slash, using that in order to cut right through the car, but Maki slid underneath it before slashing upwards, aiming to land a slash hard on Sukuna's chest. Sukuna jumped backwards in order to dodge, or at least that was his plan, until somebody else landed behind him and landed a hard punch right onto his spine, landing another black flash. Yuji Itadori had now arrived, but in that moment he also connected with Megumi, trying to pull him out but he couldn't do it. He could see the depressed state Megumi was in. The Executioner Sword was sadly going to be their only option. Megumi just wasn't going to fight back. But more importantly, that allowed Maki to land her slash right onto Sukuna's chest. Sukuna groaned in pain before he released a rapid amount of slashes on both Yuji as well as Maki, using that in order to launch the both of them away from himself. He could sense his reverse curse sneak was starting to get sloppy. He needed to be careful. More than that, he needed to focus curse energy around his chest. It was now getting harder and harder to heal, not to mention the damage and weakening he took because of the black flash. The brat was being such an annoying pest, still managing to get in the way even now. Maki and Yuji sent a smirk to each other. Now that they were here, it was time for their final push. That black flash was going to pave the pathway to defeating Sukuna. They just needed to both be relentless. They couldn't give up. They needed to make sure Higuruma would have the perfect opening. That was their path to victory. As a piercing blood went right past her head, instead going straight for Sukuna, forcing Sukuna to lift up one of his arms in order to block, as he then sensed Garuda being launched right towards his spine, seemingly going for the exact same spot that Yuji had landed his black flash on. Sukuna forced curse energy to his legs in order to move out of the way, but as he did so, Yuki rushed right for his other side, aiming to land a punch onto him. Sukuna just barely had enough time in order to hop off air himself, just barely flipping over Yuki and landing behind her. Seeing how many people were present here, he didn't have any choice. Scale of the Dragon, Recoil. Before he could finish that next chant, Yuji activated Anti-Gravity's reversal and used it to slam Sukuna hard into the ground, forcing him face first as he then activated Domain Amplification. Seeing Yuki about to launch another punch down on him, he just narrowly managed to move out of the way, but his usage of the World Cutting Slash was cancelled, missing the time period. He then sent Simple Domain being activated right behind him, as Kusakabe landed a hard slash right onto Sukuna's back, pushing Sukuna forward as Sukuna kicked him right in the cheek, launching Kusakabe away and through one of the walls. But Yuji quickly closed the gap, as he landed another black flash right onto Sukuna's stomach, swapping techniques this time to Shrine in order to land several cuts right onto him, using their small amount of contact in order to take advantage of that as Sukuna jumped back, only then for Maki to slice off one of his other arms from behind. Now was their chance. Now's finally their chance in order to win this, as Yuji activated the reversal of Anti-Gravity, using it in order to slam Sukuna hard into the ground, and Higuruma rushed for Sukuna's backside. At the same time, the rest of them were all rushing towards Sukuna in order to weaken him. But Sukuna focused, utilizing Domain Amplification, using that in order to move himself out of the way and focusing curse energy towards his hands and feet, in order to launch himself upwards to avoid the strike. Yuji, Maki, and Higuruma all chased after Sukuna in the air, Yuji using Anti-Gravity on Higuruma in order to allow him to fly, as all three of them chased after Sukuna, and Sukuna began to chant, Scale of the Dragon. But before he could finish off that chant, he felt another curse technique land on him, someone he completely forgot about, Nobara Kugasaki. Interrupting his chant, as Maki sliced off one of his arms, Yuji landed another black flash on Sukuna, and most of all, Higuruma stabbed the Executioner blade right into him, killing Sukuna, and freeing Megumi Fushiguro. The battle had been won. They did it. Ryoma Sukuna was finally dead, as they all landed on the ground with Yuji catching Megumi, before handing them off to Maki, as he felt himself about to fall over. Even with all the black flashes he landed, he was still rather exhausted. Thankfully, Choso was there to catch him. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they had managed to win. While Sukuna released a large amount of cursed spirits, that wasn't anything too difficult for them to handle, especially with strong sorcerers like Aoi Todo already on the field as well as Akari Kinji. Not to mention, when all the other sorcerers from the battle against Sukuna joined in, they effectively ended this entire situation. At the end of the day, they still ultimately only had 2 casualties. However, there was going to be a much more difficult task coming up for them pretty soon, which was the much more depressed state that Megumi was left in. But between Yuji having a similar talk with him that he had in canon, of course this one not being under the context of Sukuna hunting them down, which actually made it hit a little bit more for Megumi. It wasn't that they needed him, they just wanted him back. Nobara also being there to help, and therapy in the future, ultimately things were looking much better for them. Now, they still had their own things left in the world to clean up. People who were reincarnated deserved their original bodies back, including the question of what was going to happen with Choso. But Choso told them that he already had something in mind. Yuji already knew what it was as well. It was something they had talked about during their time training, as Yuji separated Choso from the vessel, before consuming Choso, allowing him to join out the rest of his brothers that Yuji had already consumed in the rest of their life. Yuki Tsukuma was going to continue her research on the soul, trying to figure out a way to potentially make more sorcerers, or make more people like Toji Fushiguro, whatever the path told her. Tengen was also going to work with this new generation of sorcerers, figuring out what the new world was going to have in store for them as they maintained their barriers. And with that, we close the story of What If Yuji awakened anti-gravity against Hanami. Thank you for all the support given. This What If was a lot of fun for me to make, and I got to do a bunch of research on anti-gravity and how gravity works, so that was fun. But for now, we're going to put this Yuji story on close. So tell me your thoughts on this series in the comment section down below. I wish the rest of y'all a good rest of your day.